Hello everyone, the following video is a compilation of 3 video essays I made over the course of about a year detailing my experience with the culture war and why I decided to share it in hopes of informing people on the outside about how it works. I also wanted to inform all of you that I have been approved as a YouTube partner and now have active channel memberships and supers. I am still unemployed, and while I'm not in any immediate financial danger, any support you can offer me would be much appreciated. Okay? Now on with the video. Picture this. You walk into the theater, or you pull up a streaming app to watch a new entry in one of your favorite franchises. The video comes up, and you eagerly anticipate a thrilling night. And then, it's not what you expect. Sure, the familiar faces are there, but something is off. Be it characters not acting like you remember, or not being treated with respect, or maybe their actions or achievements in the previous entry aren't being taken seriously, or even straight up forgotten. So, you leave feeling dissatisfied and possibly angry. You take to the internet and you are flooded with articles, posts, and videos decrying critics of the new thing as, insert your preferred discriminatory word here. And your response is an understandable, "That's all wrong! I didn't like it because I thought the story was bad, or my favorite characters weren't respected, or the lore wasn't kept consistent. I don't hate women or minorities. I just want good writing and consistency with the rest of the franchise." If you weren't angry before, you certainly are now. Eventually, you stumble across others who agree with you. They're a minority in the internet-wide discussion, but they are just as furious as you are, both at the people handling the franchise and the media decrying criticism as discriminatory. So you follow them, and you stick with them as they continue to cover new releases of the franchise and the media's coverage of it, even as the views they are expressing start to shift. This is not my story, but it almost was. And today, I'm going to tell you about it. I wasn't going to make this video until later on, but with the discussion sparked by the cancellation of The Acolyte, it's become incumbent upon me to share my story about the culture war that's been raging around this franchise for nearly a decade now. Not only is it something I have a lot of thoughts about, but it's something that no one seems to know the whole story of. Granted, I've seen some comments that have noticed what I've noticed, but whenever I see someone on the outside speak on it, they always seem to lack understanding of why fans are angry and disappointed, or why the flames of controversy grew as big as they did. Always responding with genuine confusion, yet still expressing concerns over what fans are doing with their time now. And I probably don't know everything either. I'm only here to offer up my personal experience, in the hope that it will clarify a few things for people on both sides. Because that's what I do here. Just a couple things before we begin. 1. I know there are a lot of hot takes when it comes to this franchise, and let me preface every criticism I'm about to give with, you can disagree with me. Different people have different interpretations of the same story, and that's totally fine. If you think my view of this or that is stupid, that's fine. I'm just here to give my personal take. 2. I will not allow any hate or harassment of any kind in the comments. You can disagree with each other respectfully, but no misogyny, no racism, no homophobia, and no transphobia will be tolerated. 3. I know a bunch of people are going to say, or at least have the attitude, that Star Wars is just a dumb fun space wizard and space battle story because it's for kids. Lucas even said so himself.
It's a film for 12-year-olds.
To you I say, yes, but that's no excuse for a severe decline in quality. Stories aimed at kids do not need to be bad or take themselves less seriously. Plenty of stories aimed at kids are still good and even great enough to keep adults interested, and of course, they are respected because they are great. I'll give a few examples most of you should be familiar with. X-Men, Justice League, Spectacular Spider-Man, The Owl House, Inside Out, The Incredibles, How to Train Your Dragon, The Hobbit, etc., etc., etc. And of course, I can't go without mentioning the ultimate example. Avatar: The Last Airbender, a children's cartoon from the same network as SpongeBob SquarePants and The Fairly Odd Parents. Yet it's considered one of the greatest TV shows of all time, even almost 2 decades after its initial release. The fact that Star Wars was initially aimed at kids is no excuse for it falling off as much as it undeniably has. And before anyone tells me it was always bad or goofy fun, yes, it has gone up and down in quality before. But as I'll explain later, I don't think the quality then and now are entirely comparable. Now, as for the goofy fun claim, all those examples I just gave have their sillier moments too, and they are all the better for it. With all that said, let's set the stage. I went to see The Force Awakens in theaters when it came out. I had been a fan for most of my life at that point, having watched the previous trilogies on DVD, and the first few seasons of Clone Wars, and all of the Clone Wars microseries, and I was excited to see a movie I'd been anticipating even before Disney bought the franchise. I saw Episode 7, and I thought it was okay. It felt too close to A New Hope in terms of its story, but it had everything I expected a new Star Wars movie to have. Then Rogue One came out, and again, I was one of those weird people who liked it. It was one of the best movies in the franchise for me, and still is. It was a story about a group of oddballs who aren't the best behaved, but they grow, and they saved the day despite how desperate the situation was. Then the next year, The Last Jedi came out, and I came out of the theater thinking it was okay. I mean, I had criticisms like some things not making sense, but I was okay with that. Then I turned to the internet, and I heard the fans speak, and I was reminded of what the previous story was supposed to be about. It was easy to forget at the time since it had been so long since I last watched the original trilogy, but the original trilogy was about a ragtag group of rebels fighting against impossible odds, but still having hope. Hope that things could get better one day. But in the sequel trilogy, the Empire just comes right back as if it never left, and after Rise of Skywalker, Palpatine also just comes right back as if he never left. This was a massive disappointment for a number of reasons. Now, from the discussion I've seen from other fans, they were disappointed too, for many reasons. Most notably, the characters from the original trilogy and how they were treated. Han is a good example to start with, since in the original movie, he starts as a scoundrel who just steals to get by and learns by the end to be a more selfless hero who stands by his friends and saves the day. In the sequel trilogy, he just reverts back to his old smuggler ways and isn't helping his wife or his best friend. That's not good. But the thing that really enraged people was what happened to Luke. In the original trilogy, he starts out as naive and whiny, but by the end, he's grown more disciplined and capable, but he still remained very hopeful, still having faith in his father even when no one else did, even his ghost mentors. And in the final battle, he empathizes with his father and overcomes his rage, rejecting the dark side once and for all. And he was right to have faith in his dad and hope he could change, and he did. It doesn't make up for everything Vader did, but it showed that light can be found even in the darkest of places, and that hope can still win. In The Last Jedi, he becomes an angry, jaded loner that needs to be shown some hope and reminded of his friends and family to get him to return to the fight. I want to be clear here. That sort of thing can work as a character arc in a vacuum. Indeed, I've seen it done this way. But that is not Luke Skywalker as I and the fanbase remembered him. We can sit here and debate about this all day about how it's realistic, or it makes sense actually because XYZ, but that doesn't matter. It's still going to feel like cognitive dissonance to many people. We saw him complete his arc and achieve something great. Then he immediately loses all of it. This portrayal is just antithetical to the core appeal of the character. As a point of comparison, the same thing happened with Superman in Man of Steel. He lets his father die, and he doesn't go out of his way to save every life he can. And he's so angry. Luke became a cultural icon because he rejected his rage, kept faith in his family and friends, and never gave up hope. Superman was created to be a kind beacon of hope who always helps those in need. The versions we see in The Last Jedi and Man of Steel respectively are not that. Now that isn't to say there shouldn't be a place for alternate takes on iconic characters or concepts. In fact, Star Wars Visions, DC's Injustice, and Marvel's What If and various comics, games, and other media do this spectacularly. And there are fans, even hardcore fans, who like this type of alternate interpretation. And if you happen to prefer one of these alternate takes, that's totally fine. It's just that it being a major release in the mainstream media for the franchise makes it seem like it's replacing the original. More on this later. That was the biggest complaint for many fans, and while I agree, personally, my biggest complaint was a bit different. The rebels in the original trilogy didn't win. Everything they fought for and built, including rebuilding the Jedi and the New Republic, just got reset, and then redone with different characters this time. Which begs the question, does the fact that the Empire came right back in a different form and the new Jedi Order was destroyed and needs to be rebuilt again make what came before pointless? This was an idea I wrestled with for a long time. Now, the answer depends on the individual. There are people I know who don't care about the lore or the timeline, or just care about the world. Personally, I debated with myself for months because I'm someone who likes to wholly immerse myself in the story and the world. I'm also someone who likes to look at the big picture when it comes to series-long plots, and I get invested in seeing everything fit together. And I felt, in a word, cheated for being invested in a story for so long, only for it to amount to nothing in the long term. Because of this frustration, I kinda stopped watching for a while and didn't even start watching The Mandalorian until Season 2 was airing. And that was only because of a brief reconciliation I had as a result of some more fan discussions. But even then, I eventually stopped watching, partially due to the declining quality I saw with The Bad Batch, which I did enjoy the first season of, but couldn't deny I was somewhat underwhelmed. And everything I've heard about the series that have been released since then didn't help. Except Andor, but it was too little too late for me at that point. And again, this is just me. Needing to have my emotional investment in a story pay off in some way when I'm invested for the long term is just very important to me. This is why I usually restrain myself when it comes to stories with continuity troubles like American superhero comics. Most of the time, I need what I'm reading or watching to matter in the story and have reason to believe it's not going to just be retconned or tossed aside. The bottom line here is that some of the choices made in the sequels are just irreconcilable for many fans, especially many hardcore fans, including me. Now, there were a lot of other issues people had with those films, such as hyperspace ramming, Holdo, Finn's character, etc. But there is one more big point I'd like to tackle before moving on. And that's the protagonist. Rey, the center of many fan theories during the trilogy, only to have been decided to be a granddaughter of a failed clone of Palpatine at the last second. She who has been the subject of much controversy in the fandom for a few reasons. Now, it's been revealed by Daisy Ridley that there wasn't really a plan for her, something I'll talk more about later. But for right now, the most important point is one of the biggest sources of controversy in discussions surrounding the trilogy even today. How powerful she is right out of the gate. So, let's look at the points. Rey's an orphan from Jakku, who scavenges ships until Finn enters her life and is on the run from the First Order, and she joins up with him, getting hunted down by the First Order, then after joining the Resistance and infiltrating the bad guy's superweapon and getting captured, learns how to use Jedi powers, including the Jedi mind trick, and uses them to escape. Then, after Finn gets defeated by an injured Kylo Ren, Rey takes the lightsaber from him and defeats him. After some minimal training, she demonstrates she doesn't understand how the Force works. After getting captured again, willingly this time, she convinces Kylo to turn on his master and fights off Snoke's guards with him, though they spend some time separated. Then they fight again, and it ends in more of a stalemate. Finally, she trains some more and is able to use Force healing and becomes, quote, all the Jedi and finally defeats Palpatine for good. A lot of fans have complained about how powerful she is, And this resulted in a lot of other fans defending her, saying things like Kylo Ren was injured, or Kylo Ren helped her in the throne room. Now, in order to explain why I'm dissatisfied with this justification, I need to go on a bit of a tangent about the existing lore and themes. So, to take a step back, the core conflict of Star Wars throughout the Skywalker saga is between the light side and the dark side of the Force. In simple terms, the light side is good and the dark side is evil, but moreover, the light side is selfless, protective, merciful, and slow to grant power. The dark side is selfish, greedy, dominating, controlling, and is quick to grant power. Light side Force users exist to protect and serve the people by settling disputes peacefully, whereas dark side Force users try to gain ultimate power or revenge or some other fundamentally selfish goal by any means necessary, no matter who they step over in the process, attempting to gain control and become so powerful that no one can stop them from getting whatever they want. The thing is, while the dark side grants power quicker than the light side, overall it falls short of the light side if a person stays true to it for long enough. What this leads to is new light side Force users getting beaten and even steamrolled by dark side Force users, especially more experienced ones, and even highly skilled non-Force users at times. The light side user might be tempted to use the dark side thinking it will grant them power to do what they want to do, and may even fall to it thinking it will make them powerful enough to do so. But if they remain true to the light side, often accepting what they cannot change, rather than trying to become powerful enough to control what happens to them, and of course they train for many, many years, they can become more powerful than most dark side Force users. And the best can become powerful enough to challenge even the worst of them. Being a Jedi requires years of training, discipline, strength of will, and a willingness to accept things you can't control. And Rey does not have that. Sure, she sometimes takes a hit or fails to turn Kylo Ren, but she doesn't have to fight for every ounce of power she gains, unlike previous Jedi in the franchise. Yes, Kylo overpowers her before she really understands how to use her powers, but once she does understand, she Jedi mind tricks a guard, something that is supposed to be a learned ability, as previously established, and she defeats a dark side user who has been training for years with barely a day of experience. Yes, Kylo Ren was injured, but that didn't stop him from beating Finn, and even if you subscribe to the idea that the injury and Finn combined wore him down and Rey just finished up, that still feels unearned. It means she was basically gift-wrapped an opponent in a weakened state for her to beat. She didn't have to suffer a heavy loss and be tempted to the dark side, and barely any time later, with barely any more training, she's able to fight Snoke's guards even when she's separated from Kylo, and later is able to at least match Kylo himself, who was also fighting the guards. And to take another look at the Kylo Ren was injured explanation, let me ask, when was it established that Force users could be injured like that, as to leave them defeatable by a soldier and a newbie Force user? Previous portrayals of Force users, light or dark, are extremely difficult to hit since they can sense incoming attacks, and either dodge or deflect almost any of them, including blaster fire. And when they are hit, it's usually a deep cut or severed limb and it completely incapacitates them. They can usually recover from Force lightning without too much trouble, but lightsaber strikes, not so much. And yes, it is possible to kill even trained Force users with blaster fire, but that's usually from overwhelming numbers like during Order 66. A Force user getting weakened and worn down and eventually beaten isn't really something that happens in Star Wars without them being straight up overpowered, since usually they can counter anything that might get thrown at them. They usually need other Force users to defeat them. Previously established Jedi have needed to take their time to gain their powers, especially to defeat powerful enemies. Luke didn't even use Force Pull until his second movie, and he doesn't even use Jedi Mind Trick until Return of the Jedi. Even after some training, he isn't able to beat Vader until Return of the Jedi. Ahsoka gets wrecked by Ventress in the Clone Wars movie and is only able to properly fight her later on. And in Rebels, she's progressed so much she can completely dominate two Inquisitors who beat Ezra, Kanan, and Zeb down with little trouble. Speaking of Rebels, Ezra, despite being able to push an enemy down using the Force without any training, didn't know what he was doing and he needed training before he can use any powers reliably in combat, and even more training before he can even stand up to an Inquisitor. Also in Rebels, Kenobi is shown to be so old and powerful that he can completely axe Darth Maul in one swing, an enemy who used to give him a challenge even during Clone Wars. Even if you think that Rey isn't too powerful for her amount of training, she lacks the same sense of linear progression that Jedi in training previously had, since she is just powerful from the beginning. And that brings me to a point I'm calling Star Wars is not Marvel, or DC, Or rather, Force users are not superheroes. You would be forgiven for seeing Star Wars as just another sci-fi franchise where cool space battles and clashes of power happen, not unlike many blockbuster movies we get nowadays. But Star Wars is not like many of those franchises, especially superhero franchises that have dominated pop culture for the past decade and a half. Superhero stories tend to be more overt power fantasies with characters gaining abilities that overwhelm almost anyone else in their world and completely destroying their enemies, only getting challenged by powerful villains whom they defeat in their own way. Many heroes defeat supervillains through sheer force of will, but some have other ways. Iron Man does it with technology and intelligence, Spider-Man often does it with agility and trickery, and Captain Marvel with overwhelming power. And to take a quick look at DC, you could make the argument that Superman defeating Zod, a trained soldier, is illogical, but it's not the same situation as Rey beating Kylo Ren. Zod isn't used to Earth's atmosphere, and the powers he as a Kryptonian has there. Superman breaking his helmet earlier in the film is a big moment because Zod is flooded with sensations he's unfamiliar with, something Superman had time to adjust to. Zod has to figure out how to use his powers during the final fight with Superman, but even then, DC and Marvel do not have the same established conventions around gradually gaining power and eventually defeating powerful villains. Sure, sometimes you see heroes training to improve their powers or skill, but they're few and far between, in comparison to Star Wars, where training is usually central, again, discounting exceptions like Visions. Hence, existing DC fans instead complained about different things after seeing Man of Steel, mainly the lack of kindness, hope, and saving as many lives as possible, all qualities that previous mainstream versions of Superman had, and the interpretations we've gotten since then have, because that is the established convention of Superman in DC media. Those qualities are why Superman fans show up, hence why they complained when a new piece of Superman media lacks them, just like a hard-fought linear progression of power over many years with discipline and training before accomplishing something significant like defeating a powerful foe is the established convention of Star Wars. Fans of Star Wars expect a battle between good and evil, selflessness and selfishness, protection and domination, and they expect good to have to persevere through setbacks and antagonists that are too powerful for them to defeat at first. The Force Awakens and Man of Steel are two different cases of two different fan bases getting angry at a recent addition to a franchise for different reasons, but both are cases of hardcore existing fans raising criticisms because the new entry, according to their interpretation, broke previously established conventions. And that brings me to my final point on this topic. We can argue all day and night until the heat death of the universe as to who is right or wrong about this subject, but that doesn't matter. I said before that people have different interpretations of the same story, but I think there's a better explanation for why so many fans were dissatisfied with the sequels and why so many others love them and will defend them any way they can. They were made with fundamentally different narrative intent than the first two trilogies and both Clone Wars animated series. They aren't what Lucas intended, and that's not just because they tossed his outline aside before writing them, or because of Rian Johnson's hard left turn in the middle, but because the people in creative control wanted to do different things with the new movies.
Can I just say though, a lot of times I would say to Ryan, you gotta think about the band. And he said, no, you gotta think about the story, and you gotta think about our movie.
I brought up Luke's fall from grace and Rey's rapid rise to power and compared them to Man of Steel to make a point about hardcore fans' expectations for new media. But statistically, casual fans make up the bulk of audiences. Thus, we get two groups that disagree fervently. There's a whole other video I could make about how fan bases can become divided. Not necessarily toxic, because that's a bigger conversation, but divided, which can still lead to toxicity. I'm sure you all know about the extreme amount of online backlash certain people involved with the franchise have gotten. One of the most famous cases being Kelly Marie Tran, who left social media, and given what I said at the beginning of this video about no tolerance for hate, you can probably tell that I don't approve of any of this. If you don't like a movie or you don't agree with someone else's opinion of a movie or any piece of media really, then do so respectfully and just walk away. Don't go out of your way to attack people to try and have your view dominate all others. That can cause real harm over a movie opinion of all things. It's also not the Jedi way, so in this case you're also demonstrating that you didn't learn anything from the story that you claim to love. Okay, with all this context established, where does that leave us? Well, if it was just the movies and subsequent TV shows, I'd have just left a long time ago and not given it much more thought, aside from continuing to watch Visions. If that were the case, I wouldn't even be making this video. But unfortunately, none of this happened in a vacuum. Yeah, not all the hate thrown around in the wake of The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker was from fans. Back then, I saw a bunch of YouTube channels that I won't name right now that were covering this and arguing against it, so of course I watched their content. Why? Because they were some of the only people who were actually criticizing the movies and, more importantly, were calling the media out for decrying the fans as sexist. Also racist because of what happened to Kelly Marie Tran. Yes, this wasn't what everyone was saying. There were people criticizing the movie normally, but the backlash to the fan backlash dominated the conversation. But if you actually read the articles, you won't find any direct quotes of the people in question saying the things the titles claim they did. Even if that wasn't the case, claiming that disliking a movie or show that happens to have a woman or minority character automatically makes someone an ist or phobe is a Mott and Bailey argumentation fallacy. A logical falsehood that uses non-controversial claims to defend more radical claims. It's incredibly frustrating when people do this with legitimately important causes like feminism, where disagreeing with them can get you branded as discriminatory. All of this will be important later, though the discourse did lead to me learning about many people I never even thought about before. Let's get to the elephant in the room. Now, I'm fully aware of the fact that I currently am not now, and certainly wasn't then, fully aware of Kathleen Kennedy's actions, statements, and intentions. But one, that isn't relevant to this conversation, since I'm talking about my experience as it happened. And two, everything I'm aware she did say undeniably feels like corporate fluff, the kind of non-controversial statements someone in her position is supposed to make. Now, I am aware that Kathleen Kennedy has been targeted and her statements have been inflated by those channels I mentioned before, but the statements I can attribute to her don't paint the best picture either. For example, there was that time she responded to a question about how difficult it was to make the next movie, Rise of Skywalker at the time, by saying that every movie is difficult to do partially because they have no source material. They don't have comic books, novels, or a bunch of other stuff. Which demonstrates that she kind of forgot about the EU, or how many fans cared about it. Or that time that Marsha Lucas spoke favorably of her, but also said that she doesn't know what she's doing with the franchise. But to sum up my thoughts on Kathleen Kennedy, I think she's seriously out of touch and maybe kind of dumb. Mostly because of how every quote I could find from her seems like manufactured corporate fluff. Like I explained before, I don't have the same conspiracy theory that other people do around her. Obviously, there is no way for me to know for sure what is going on behind the scenes, though the simplest explanation is often the correct one. Kennedy's intentions aren't bad, but the decisions she's made as president of Lucasfilm have been in the name of feminism and diversity. Worthy causes, but I don't agree with what she and those like her have done in pursuit of those goals. And personally, I firmly believe that same goal could have been achieved without any of the drama or baggage. Instead, she has kind of given feminism and diversity a bad name among certain fans. Briefly jumping forward a bit, the discussion sparked by the cancellation of The Acolyte is largely what sparked the desire in me to expedite the creation of this video that's been kicking around in my brain for the past several years. And conveniently, it demonstrates a lot of what I've been saying. Apart from being a project that Kathleen Kennedy was a primary supporter of,
Star Wars is always about rebels versus institutional threat. So if we said it then the Jedi become the antagonists. Not the bad guys, but they become the bad guys to the bad guys. And I gotta say, Kathy really responded to that. I think it's difficult to do a show that is critical in any way of the Jedi. And I think that you saw that with Ryan's film. In that moment, people were very nervous about saying this particular institution may not be the light and, perfect, stunning group of heroes that are totally nobly intentioned. But I think when you think you're going to tell the story about bad guys and the Jedis might be the antagonists to to those Jedis, I think that makes people nervous. But it didn't make Kathy nervous.
Editing Mythos here, I realized that I didn't do the best job of specifying what I was trying to say here. Brie Larson's statements and Leslie Headland's creative choices with the Acolyte aren't all that inflammatory. What really caused the firestorm on social media was the specific context combo of creative choices, possibly contradictory to the existing franchise's creative vision, followed by fan backlash, followed by media shaming fans and calling them discriminatory, followed by certain influencers reacting to all of it and blaming the activism, or post the release of The Last Jedi, the middle two steps can be skipped, but aren't always skipped, and the established rage bait influencers just get angry at any mention of diversity for clicks. The point I'm getting at here is that you can't just point fingers and lay the blame entirely on the fans being toxic, or even on the influencers being inflammatory. It's the engagement-driven algorithms that run social media which enable this sort of hate campaign. Her and Leslie Headland's vision do not align with the original vision of Star Wars. Headland wanted to make a series that cast the Jedi in an unfavorable light, having them commit more morally questionable and even tyrannical things, portraying them as significantly more flawed than they were in the prequels and Clone Wars, while also portraying the dark side in a more favorable or at least sympathetic manner. It's an interesting idea that has a lot of potential, and could be explored in Star Wars, but like I said earlier, probably should not have been a part of the main timeline, and would be better suited to a non-canon side story like Visions. Speaking of Visions, actually, Season 2, Episode 2 actually made the Sith perspective sympathetic in a way that would have worked in the main timeline, by making it a story around conquering fear, yet still making it clear that the Sith way is not the right way. Jedi that stay true to the light side are fundamentally selfless. Control and domination is a dark side trait. The Jedi of the prequels fell and drove Anakin to the dark side because they became too detached, not because they got too tyrannical. But returning to the pre-Mandalorian era, the bottom line is, following the release of Rise of Skywalker, mainstream perception of Star Wars as a franchise was not good. The idea getting pushed was that the fans were being entitled, toxic, bigoted, and the franchise as a whole was just kinda dumb. Sort of like right now. But two things helped break the never-ending spiral of heated discussion. The first was John Boyega and Daisy Ridley, Finn and Rey's actors, revealing some things about the production of the trilogy. John Boyega saying he was cast for his race, which confirmed what a lot of critics of the time were saying, that his character should have had more time. Daisy Ridley's statement that Rey's true heritage was decided on late in development, which also confirmed what many critics of the time were saying, that there was no plan for the trilogy, they just winged it and it didn't work. Then The Mandalorian was released, which largely heralded the trends of lots of shows getting made leading to where we are now. But what's important for us today is that discussions of representation and wokeness in the mainstream got heated. Even after the talk around Star Wars died down, the damage was done. Wokeness was a hot topic and the media knew it. This unfortunately led to more fuel on the fire as more franchises were getting dragged into the conversation. The first one that I remember was Disney's other massive money-making franchise, Marvel, specifically Captain Marvel, mostly from the actress when she said this, and this. I actually didn't see the movie when it came out because of the controversy. I saw it recently for this video, and I thought it was okay. Not great, not bad, just okay. There were some things I like about it, and even Brie Larson's performance wasn't too bad, and I do like some of the scenes. If I had watched it during the peak of my MCU fan hype, I probably would have really enjoyed it. Though I admit, it isn't as good as many of the other Marvel movies that were coming out at the time. So in the midst of all the controversy churned up by The Last Jedi, I can understand why it attracted as much attention as it did, and why it basically had a passing of the torch effect from The Last Jedi. Then there's the Arrowverse.
I need you to fix his suit.
The suit is literal perfection.
It will be. When it fits a woman.
Moving on to other things I watched just for this video, Mulan, both the original and the remake. And I had a similar reaction as I did to Captain Marvel, just without the MCU context, and with Mulan 2020 being significantly more meh. Mulan is just powerful right out of the gate, and she has to learn not to suppress who she is, and then she just solos all the most powerful enemies in the movie, kind of like Carol. Looking at franchises that I'm less familiar with, this also happened with Doctor Who with the 13th Doctor, the first female Doctor. I can't name very many episodes of Doctor Who aside from the very few I've seen, but I do know of the Timeless Child, and I know it retconned huge amounts of the lore. I know Doctor Who has retconned its continuity before, but I can't name any of those other episodes, nor what series they were from, nor what happens in them. But I know about the Timeless Child because of how inflamed it made the fanbase, so much that even I, someone who doesn't really care about Doctor Who that much, heard about it. But the best example I can give is Masters of the Universe Revelation. I am not a He-Man fan, but I know way too much about what happens right at the beginning of this show. Again, because the fire spread to my circles. He-Man dies immediately and gets replaced by a female character called Teela, who is not happy about many of the things he did before he died. Every one of those examples came out around the same time as The Last Jedi, or after it. And that's without considering all of those articles I showed before, which inflate statements made by people and then don't provide quotes of them saying the thing. This is really just clickbait, something most of us are familiar with, but none of us are immune. Because of all that and John Boyega's complaints, I've legit wondered how many of these diverse casting choices, or even certain creative choices over the past several years, only happened because studio execs knew it would stir up heated debates online and create a ton of free advertising, as well as convincing a bunch of people to go see the movie or watch the show just to piss off the bigots. I can believe that an individual artist or actor wants to provide representation for genuine reasons. But I am less likely to believe that about an executive. There's no way to know for sure what instances were made for that reason, but it's a phenomenon that has been capitalized on by corporations before. H-Bomber Guy has a video about this exact thing, and it doesn't even talk about narrative-focused media like shows and movies. So with all that being said, why are people fighting for diversity? No, really, this is a serious question. I mean, you'd think I'd know at this point since I've made a few videos on the topic, but that's because I've been told by other people that it's important. Like, a lot of people. And I've had my own experiences with it that I've spoken on before. But when it comes to actual, observable scientific evidence, I honestly tried. I even whipped out Google Scholar, something I haven't done since college, to try and find some evidence, and after several attempts, I got nothing. So just going off of what other people have said, and my own experience as an ADHD, asexual, non-binary individual, representation is about a few things. The first is acknowledgement. Having a critical part of your identity be ignored and possibly unknown to the people around you and society at large can feel alienating, especially if it's something you don't fully understand. Simply having it acknowledged can feel validating. Which brings me to, second, relatability. Feeling not just acknowledged, but understood. Helping someone connect to a story on a much deeper level, which carries all the usual effects a good story can have on a person. I've seen some naysayers say, why can't you relate to a character that isn't exactly like you? But just going off of my own experience, it's not that we can't relate our personal life to a character that isn't exactly like us, it's more so relating via a particular experience or aspect of your identity. Just looking at my favorite Percy Jackson Universe Top 20 Favorite Characters video that I made a few months ago, I love characters like Alex and Reyna for how I related my gender variance and asexual experiences respectively to them. Neither of them is exactly like me, but I still appreciate that they exist, and I loved the scenes with them, even though neither of them was my favorite character on that list. Like, my favorite fictional character of all time in all media is literally a cis-straight white guy with blonde hair and blue eyes. Aside from the white part, none of those things describe me. Third is education. Many identities are still not known in the mainstream, so sometimes the media can help others understand the group being represented. Which brings me to my final point, desensitization. This is a small point, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Exposure can help people get used to seeing someone different and seemingly alien. In fact, this doesn't just apply to different groups of people, it can be literally anything that the person is afraid of due to a lack of experience. And this is just my view, and if you have your own experiences you'd like to share, please do so in the comments. Especially if you're from an underrepresented group I couldn't cover, like BIPOC people or certain religious groups. Though, this begs the question, With all these examples I've just given of diversity being added and it stirs up online hate, which means free advertising, can diversity be added without, that, or harming the narrative or lore of an existing franchise? Why is that even a question? Of course it can, and it's been done many times. Sure, some drama might get stirred up, but it doesn't need to be as bad as it was with Star Wars. Actually, that brings me to my next topic. Examples of representation being done right without needing the attached drama. Starting off, I want to look at women or minority characters leading previously male-led franchises. First, there's Jolene Cujo from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Part 6, Stone Ocean. Now, I know that Part 6 has a somewhat controversial reputation in the JoJo fanbase, but 1, it's not because it stars a woman, and 2, it's nowhere near as heated as the discourse we've looked at so far. And 3, there are a lot of fans that defend it and have come forth talking about how much they love it, myself included. From what I can tell, now that anime-only fans have gotten to experience it properly, and manga readers don't have to depend on fan translations, Stone Ocean is somewhat more respected in the JoJo fandom, despite the fact that it starts off with, minor spoiler warning, the previous male lead, the most iconic character in the series, getting completely disabled, and the focus is just put on these 3 girls. Araki just did what he always does, and made the best effort to give them the same treatment as the previous JoJo teams, and it works. Another example, The Legend of Korra. Now, this show is also somewhat controversial within its fanbase, and there are many who don't like it, but like Stone Ocean, it's still respected and enjoyed by the majority of existing hardcore fans. And it added a lot to the world and lore of the franchise, and while not all of it is good, there's enough there that it had a net positive effect on the Avatar franchise as a whole. Oh, and Korra's bisexual, though this was only touched upon. And the fans at large still love her, despite LGBTQ+ rep not being as common in kids' cartoons back in the day. Getting a bit more explicitly gay, let's look at the Percy Jackson universe. Author Rick Riordan has taken a few representational opportunities with his series before, such as the Kane siblings from the Kane Chronicles being multiracial, Magnus questioning his sexuality in the Magnus Chase series, and Apollo being very openly bisexual in Trials of Apollo. But for this section, I wanted to focus more on The Sun and the Star, a book he co-wrote with openly queer author Mark Oshiro for that added bit of authenticity. I've already talked about this book before on my channel, so I'll be brief here. It takes the gay Nico D'Angelo and his bisexual boyfriend Will Solis and dives deep into their psyches, including their queer struggles, and we watch them come out the other side as stronger people. It's a great story, and I highly recommend it and the entire Riordanverse to anyone willing to give it a read. Stepping outside of examples explicitly about passing the torch in big franchises, there are tons of others I could give, but I don't have the time right now. So we've established that this did not need to happen, but the fact of the matter is that it did happen. So where does this leave us? Well, the controversy kept going for a while because people kept putting fuel on the fire, and it's continued to this very day. Part of the problem is how polarized these conversations got. Because of the algorithms running our daily lives, giving us more of what we agree with, anger spreads rapidly and polarization is inevitable. And that has consequences. Remember those YouTube channels I brought up before who criticized The Last Jedi and called out the media for shaming fans? Whom I did not name explicitly, but you all probably know about them already. The Critical Drinker, Nerdrotic, Geeks and Gamers, Heels v Babyface, Shadiversity, etc. Yeah, I used to watch a few of their videos unironically because they were angry for the same reason I was. Getting labeled man-babies for disliking a film. But eventually they moved on from Star Wars and other things like it, and started ranting about the mere mention of diversity in basically any new piece of media. And they grew and grew over the years to the point where many of them have hundreds of thousands or even millions of subscribers. That's how you get Starfield Pronouns Guy going viral. Which begs the question, what the fuck did I just watch happen? Well, just looking at what we know, it looks like the controversy happened due to incompetence and mishandling a popular franchise, and the media chose to capitalize on that. Possibly executives did too. Then a bunch of YouTubers jumped on it, causing them to grow dramatically to the point where they are basically a media empire that runs on never-ending rage at the latest thing. And we've gone from fandom misunderstandings to literally millions of people who've been told that diversity equals bad. and the woke mob are taking over your favorite franchises, and it's gotten bad enough that the people who work on these franchises are starting to notice and acknowledge the backlash even more. But that's not all that happened. You see, this guy, he's Tim Pool, and he runs a podcast. And he also had Nerdrotic from the group I mentioned before on said podcast. Why is any of that important? Well, Tim Pool was discovered as having been receiving funding from Russia, which isn't too surprising considering he was spouting anti-Ukraine sentiments. So there's clearly some common sentiments between these two. And no, I'm not claiming all of Nerdrotic's group are pro-Russia or anti-Ukraine. I'm just saying they clearly agree on at least a few things. I do not have it in me to cover a topic like this. I do not want real-world geopolitics on my channel, so I'll link videos by Pillar of Garbage and Illegal Eagle that can explain it much better than I can. Ugh, that escalated quickly. But to take things back to Star Wars and other franchises for a moment, we come at long last to the primary reason I made this video. Almost no one on the outside seems to possess any understanding of why things turned out like this. Despite the discourse centering on one of the biggest film franchises in existence, which is probably due to most fans being casual fans, though it's the other major consequence I've seen of polarization. Too many people in real life, even those I know and trust, don't seem to get why fans of certain franchises are upset. And this goes for basically every YouTube channel I've seen that is not always in on the Star Wars discussion. They'll say things like media has always been political and give a number of examples as to why, often using the original Star Wars trilogy itself in the process, but none of them seem to grasp why the discourse got to the point that it has. If you're a mega fan of a particular franchise, most people in your real life are probably not, so you probably won't find anyone to talk to about it, or anyone who empathizes with your complaints or is even willing to listen to you. But you're still pissed and you want something to validate your anger, so you turn to social media. And like I said before, anger spreads online, whatever gets the most engagement gets promoted by the algorithm, and thus toxic fans have dominated the critical side of the discourse. So people respond to them and counter their arguments since they were made by bigots. But this ends up eclipsing conversations around the story, and that has prevented criticism of it, even good faith criticism, especially from hardcore fans from even being in the discourse with progressives. Though that may just be my experience. And thus the echo chamber polarization feedback loop continues. Having realized all of this, I wondered how alone I was, because at the time, I was someone who identified as a cishet man for most of their life, and grew up with Star Wars, so I understood why hardcore fans got as angry as they got. But I was also raised to see discrimination as a bad thing, and eventually learned to accept and support the LGBTQ people in my life, long before I realized I was one of them. So I understand the other side, and felt like there was no need for media discussions to go down the road that they did. I get that racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, etc. are all massive problems in our society today. But a big reason why things have gotten as bad as they did is because new entries in existing franchises pissed fans off because they were either bad sequels or were just incompetently made. Then the media poured gasoline on the flames, and the algorithms that run internet discourse did what they do best and recommended more content that gets the most engagement. For a while, I thought I was largely on my own in my understanding of this, but in recent memory, I've started seeing more people acknowledge at least some of the issues I've discussed in this video. It's not much, but it feels a lot better knowing I'm not alone in my beliefs and experiences here. And there is one more bit of franchise discourse I'd like to highlight. Let's talk about Rings of Power. When the show was being promoted, we started seeing that there were going to be black elves. And I'm sure I don't need to summarize what happened next at this point. But anyways, sometime later, we got this video from a known Tolkien expert, Timothy Hickson, aka Hello Future Me. It was a massive breakdown of the show analyzing why it doesn't work as a show or as an adaptation of the appendices of Lord of the Rings. Yeah, fun fact, Amazon does not have the rights to the Silmarillion, only appendices referring to it. In any case, the video used to end with a massive look at the anti-woke influencers, or the woke bros as Tim called them, until Tim cut it out because he realized it didn't match what he was trying to say. But before he removed it, a few commenters had some of their own takes on the engagement farm. Marina Angelska says, I'm just disappointed that one important aspect was not mentioned in the Woke Bros discussion. It wasn't all lonely young men who watched those videos. I, as a feminist woman, ended up watching them for one simple reason. If you call people racist when they're not, if you call people bigoted when they're not, you just push them to the channels who won't insult them every second and will not make them feel like they're crazy for wanting Tolkien's lore and writings to be respected. As you said, there are ways to introduce diversity in these stories and keep true to what Tolkien wrote. But when anyone mentioned that, they were immediately called a racist and bigot. People don't seem to understand that the quickest way to radicalize is to keep calling someone an ist or phobe when they are not. Yes, as a woman, woke bro videos are sometimes hard to watch. Or were. I don't watch any of them anymore. But sometimes you only want to watch a video without being insulted. And, unfortunately, at times it can feel like they are the only ones providing that. Tim noticed this and said, "You're totally spot on here, totally worth bringing into the discussion." A space ostrich said, I distinctly remember calling this trend out as a kid in high school. My generation were essentially all feminists by default. It's how we were raised, and if I remember hitting high school, call-out culture had started hitting its stride and people would get called sexist or racist at the drop of the hat, when they weren't. I remember looking around and seeing all the young men that were struggling and being called sexist and privileged whenever they tried to talk about their issues. This was when the term privilege first hit the public vocabulary, so it was used everywhere. And I said at the time, if you keep doing all this, you're going to push all these young men towards the right. When they're faced with two sides, and one side openly mocks them and calls them sexist when they complain about it, while the other side is welcoming, understanding, and calls the first side out, which do you think they are going to go towards? In response, I was called sexist, of course, and people said if being called sexist makes you sexist, you were sexist all along. Needless to say, Kid Me hit the nail on the head. And the manosphere began to emerge a few short years after I predicted it would. I think the older progressives don't quite understand how dominant progressive ideas were in younger generations. When the millennials were growing up, feminism and progressive ideas were the underdog. When I was growing up, they were the default, which means you've got a whole generation of young men being treated like shit by both traditional society and the dominant popular culture of their time. The people who are supposed to be the quote-unquote good guys of society making things better, essentially telling them that they don't matter, and that they're bad people for even having problems in the first place. If you're ever wondering how the alt-right gained popularity, this is why. They were handed power on a silver platter by bigoted faux progressives in the late 2000s and early 2010s. It was so obvious even an ignorant sheltered child like I was at the time could see it coming. There's technically more comments in that thread, but I'm going to end it with Linda McNamara1298, who touches on a lot of points I've already made in this video. Agreed. I also think would need to rewatch some of these woke bro videos to confirm, and I don't really want to, but I think some of their earliest videos on Rings of Power did focus a bit more on actual writing issues in a genuine way, but that is what made their channels took off. They got an audience of a particular demographic who want to see this content be more political, or sexist, racist, homophobic more specifically, and they started pandering to that audience to earn more YouTube dollars. I recall going off these guys when they really started going off a hateful deep end. Yes! Fuck yes! I could not have put it any better myself. I have seen a number of people talking about how the rage bait engagement farm works, but with very few exceptions, I don't really see pro-diversity channels acknowledge the faults of the people who make these unfaithful sequels, or the media who stoked the fire. There's a reason I used the comments from Hello Future Me's video, because that's literally the only place I could find any serious discussions of this topic. And when your feelings are dismissed, you look for validation elsewhere. Thus the feedback loop continues. That's why I made this video. To share my story, and to speak to both sides for just a moment. If you're someone who genuinely wants more diversity in the media you love, consider looking for examples of it being done well that also respects the existing franchise. Or creating your own if you have the skills to do so. And if you're someone who cares about these young men and you don't understand why they don't like a new quote-unquote progressive piece of media, even after watching this long, let them dislike it, even if you disagree. As long as their reasoning isn't obviously bigoted. Ultimately, I did all this because I was frustrated, and not with Star Wars itself. When The Force Awakens came out, all I wanted was to enjoy a story like I'm sure most people who watched the movies. and I'd love to just move on with my life at this point, but with how synonymous disliking the sequels, and Rey in particular, and The Acolyte has become with toxic screaming fans and harassing actresses, I was often afraid to express how I really felt, and that was without the self-discovery I was going through with my sexuality and my gender. In a way, I felt torn between staying true to my community and being honest about my views in the sequel trilogy. It's something that's affected videos all the way back to the beginning of my channel. But as you can tell, at this point, I decided to just voice how I really felt. And you can disagree with me, and if you've got a better way to address any of the societal issues I've brought up, or you've got factual evidence that one or more of my points is wrong, please let me hear them. All I want is for people to respect each other's opinions. Now before I end this video, I've got one more point to make. When I see feminists creating media like the sequel trilogy, Captain Marvel, Masters of the Universe Revelation, Mulan 2020, and The Acolyte, I agree with what they're trying to do, but I don't agree with their methods. Something I've seen remarkably few people acknowledge, outside of my trans and NB siblings, is that the patriarchy hurts men too. Manly men stereotypes make it hard for them to express their emotions without being perceived as weak. It's harder for them to approach women socially without being perceived as sexual. As someone designated male at birth, I can attest to those personally. In our society today, girls mature faster and they get better grades. People have fought for women's rights and progress has been made, but it's gotten to the point where women are outperforming men in some key areas. So if you want to combat the patriarchy, you should consider acknowledging men's issues and offering them empathy and help, or even a solution if you can. And perhaps the solution isn't pitting men and women against each other or trying to put one above the other or deflecting criticism of a piece of media by telling men it wasn't made for them, but to let everyone make their own way regardless of stereotypes. Have your inclusive main casts, BIPOC characters, queer characters, strong independent women, but also consider including examples of positive healthy masculinity. And I want to say here that power level doesn't even need to be a factor. Some of the most beloved characters in fantasy or superhero stories are those with less power, or even those without powers. And being me, I'd be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to recommend a few stories that exemplify what I'm talking about. I brought up both Avatar cartoons, the Riordanverse, and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure before, but there's also all of this other stuff that I don't have the time to talk about right now. But I'd recommend in a heartbeat to anyone who is interested. And that's without all of the books, manga, and anime that I've either got videos on, or have videos coming down the pipeline covering, which may be out by the time you're watching. Not all of them are perfect, and plenty of them have their flaws or blind spots, but each one has plenty of its own strengths. If you're a young, straight, cisgender, able-bodied white man, or perhaps someone with most of those qualities who's also frustrated by how the culture war has treated you, I thank you for indulging me for this long, and I hope I can offer you something that you will genuinely enjoy, despite how different we may be. But whoever you are, if you've watched this long, I thank you dearly. Thank you so much for just letting me share my side of the story. And no matter where you came from, I hope to see you again next time.
He also mentioned about the weaponization of the term woke, which I don't think this is something that gets discussed enough. And he questioned why anybody wouldn't want to be awake, which I think is a wonderful way of putting it. I don't understand how a term like woke has become something that is described and viewed as some big negative. Like, for me, woke is equivalent to open-minded and decent human being. If you're not woke, then that's you, but I don't know why it would be something people would mock.
I think I can answer that question. In short, it's complicated. While I certainly didn't think I'd be doing this again, Last year I made the longest and most complicated video I've ever made on my channel, Star Wars The Culture War's Confessions of a Fan, detailing my journey as a Star Wars fan, how I started as a young wide-eyed kid enamored with the sci-fi and fantasy of it all, and how many years later I watched as the sequel trilogy kicked up the worst online firestorm I've ever seen. Explaining why it made all of us so mad, the ways the fan anger was exploited and made worse, and how all of this could have been avoided. And finally, diving into the fallout of it all with a bunch of grifter influencers who turned stoking and farming fan rage into a very lucrative business, which also made a lot of hate spread online to certain groups. In case you're wondering, no, that video is not required viewing to understand this one, but watching it later might help provide additional context. It was the most effort I'd ever put into a video at the time, but I thought it would be a one-time thing when I made it. In the following months, however, I realized that the controversy surrounding Star Wars was only part of the whole story. A significant part, certainly, but not necessarily a major part. In the past few months, I started watching and in some cases rewatching videos by people who had a similar experience to me in falling down a pipeline of hateful rhetoric, and how they got out of it. Most of those videos are several years old at this point, but only watching them after making my Star Wars video did I see them in a new light. I realized that my experience was not unique, and it wasn't unique to Star Wars fans or fans of other pop culture IPs either. I needed to take a step back and examine my journey to truly understand the issue, and explain why I was able to stop myself from falling in completely, and most importantly, what I think we should all take away from this, and at least try to make things a bit better. Because, 1, if the opening clip didn't make it obvious, I realized that a lot of people who talk about this stuff, from the engagement farm to the overuse, misuse, and eventual weaponization of the word woke, simply do not understand the mindset of the people on the other side, and how they became so full of hate. And the misunderstanding is part of the reason we are in this situation. And 2, the problem has gotten big enough that mainstream media is taking notice. And since I came dangerously close to being one of those people, I decided to share my perspective as someone who used to identify as a cishet white young man when most of this took place. And in case any of you are worried, no, this is not a sign of my channel becoming more political. The Mythos Archives will always be a media analysis channel first and foremost. These videos are the exception. I may make other video essays in the future, but they will mostly be focused on media analysis and occasionally fandom analysis. Another reason I'm making this video is because a lot of it is relevant to the conversations we have about our favorite stories, both past and present. And like I said, I hope sharing my experience will help clear things up. So, dear viewer, let me take you on a journey. A journey starting all the way back in the early 2010s. Back in the day, YouTube wasn't as much of a well-oiled machine as it is today. I mean, it still sucks today in a lot of ways, but it was even more freeform back then. Less commercialized, with sponsors and merch not yet being ubiquitous. Streaming services weren't dominating the conversation, and physical media was still the default. Gaming had existed for a while, but it wasn't as mainstream as it is today. It was still a relatively new medium. So of course, that means video games must cause violence. It happens with literally every new medium. It's new and unknown, so clearly it incites violence. In hindsight, I know this was just a fear-mongering tactic, whether the people who said these things actually believed what they said, but the violence narrative got big, just like it did for TV, comics, and movies before. Naturally, this made a lot of us very angry, since we were being called guilty or part of the problem just for enjoying something we loved. Studies eventually came out that disproved it, but this did not stop the fear-mongering. It just kinda faded after several years. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only thing games were getting accused of. Gamergate happened. You've all heard about it, but as a quick refresher, Aaron Ganji accused his partner Zoe Quinn of using a sexual relationship with a game reviewer for a positive review. Aaron made this accusation on his blog, then it blew up and started a mass harassment campaign against Zoe Quinn that was blatantly misogynistic in nature. This inevitably brought a lot more attention to misogyny in the games industry, and with that, Anita Sarkeesian. Another name I'm sure you've all heard of, but in case you haven't, she's a feminist who primarily speaks on the internet and sometimes at events. She critiqued pop culture media, but she's primarily known for her views on video games. mainly for criticizing their portrayal of women in various minority groups and reinforced negative stereotypes of them. Now, before I express my opinion of her, along with how it has changed over time, I am going to explain my thoughts as they were at the time. Just know that my thoughts on her have changed since then, and I'll talk about that later. On the surface, there might not seem to be anything wrong with Anita's criticisms, but she had a habit of coming across as accusatory, taking the most negative stance possible, and most notably for us today, she would call out people who hated her and use it as evidence that the gaming community was toxic and why her criticisms were needed. It allowed her a lot of press, including appearances in the mainstream news. With that, she started a series called Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, which was a massive breakdown on how women in various minority groups are portrayed in video games, and how she felt they were stereotypical, namely misogynistic, racist, and homophobic. For the gaming community, this carried a lot of the same mindset as the accusation of video games causing violence, i.e., video games are bad for people and cause bad behavior. What really set people off was how easily she would condemn a game for the most insignificant thing, like a single character animation or the option to kill an NPC. Her Twitter was even worse. I found myself checking it every couple years or so in college, and even years after Gamergate died down, she would routinely make sweeping negative statements about the gaming community, just as she did back in the day. If you want a more comprehensive look at her entire career, I recommend this video by the Gamer from Mars. It makes a number of good points, including showing a person at a Q&A Anita was on, who told her that it's better to focus on positive portrayals because focusing on negative portrayals to criticize them is only going to promote more negativity. More on this later. At the time, Anita bothered me because I just wanted to play my games in peace. I never held any racist, misogynistic, or homophobic beliefs, and it felt like Anita was making a mountain out of a molehill, and she was being taken seriously and was furthering a negative stereotype of gamers. Now here I want to take a moment to talk about the mindset that I and others had. Namely that most straight, cis, young white men believe that things like racism, misogyny, etc. all went away a long time ago, and everyone was basically equal then. As someone who was still identifying as a straight, cis, white young man at the time, I can attest to that. As far as I could tell, women had equal rights, and I had never seen a black person get mistreated, so I just assumed it didn't happen anymore. Or if it was still present, it wasn't all that bad. I wasn't as up to date on LGBTQ issues either. I sort of didn't think about gay people too much at the time, assuming I would never really run into them. And any mention of gender transition or sex change made me extremely uncomfortable, and I just decided not to think about it. But any acknowledge of it was also super rare, so I just pushed it to the back of my mind. Boy oh boy, times have sure changed since then. So when I saw Anita complaining about the smallest of things and voicing negative stereotypes of gamers, and get taken seriously for it, I became very frustrated. I wasn't watching YouTube as fervently as I do now, but I was still watching it a lot. So of course, I watched as the community responded and proceeded to rip Anita's arguments apart. And she wasn't the only one. Other feminists and people who fought against racism started going viral, especially those that seemed like they were overreacting to something. At the time, we called these people SJWs, which stands for Social Justice Warrior, and it basically meant anyone who overreacted to almost anything in the name of combating systemic issues, especially in an overtly hostile way. That being hostile towards the viewers, whether or not they held any sexist or racist beliefs, or think that they did. This coincided with the stereotype of political correctness. I want to specify here that I never excused the harassment and threats Anita and others received here. Threatening people on the internet makes you far worse than the people you are accusing. In other words, doing so is never okay. One last point I'd like to touch on before I move on is when Anita Sarkeesian was brought up by my college professor. There was one moment during a lecture when my professor had mentioned her in class and portrayed her like she was nothing but a victim who dared call out the sexist gaming culture. I went to her in office hours and tried to make a case that this was misrepresenting what actually happened. I didn't have as much self-confidence at the time, especially when it came to people with authority over me, like my professors, and I wasn't as good at explaining myself back then, so it went poorly. That being said though, I didn't like that my professor, someone who I was supposed to see as intelligent and understanding of how the world works, felt like she was trying to excuse all of Anita's more extreme actions. I did manage to be reasonable enough that I never came remotely close to getting reprimanded for this, but I still left that room feeling deeply unsatisfied. There is one thought I neglected to mention in this conversation, but I'll get to that later. I didn't give much thought to this afterwards, but a few months before this went down, The Last Jedi came out, and now we've caught up to my Star Wars video. In case you haven't seen it, I'll recap it briefly. The Force Awakens got some positive reception when it came out, then Rogue One came out the next year and was received somewhat positively, then The Last Jedi came out the year after that. There were a lot of reasons people disliked that movie, which I detailed last time, but what's most important for us today, looking at it and The Force Awakens with the benefit of hindsight, the problems are as follows. Rey is able to use a lightsaber without any training and is able to fight Kylo Ren, a trained Force user, and defeat, or at least match him in multiple fights without any training, which contradicts how the light versus dark and Jedi versus Sith dynamic had been portrayed in previous movies and shows. There, Force users, and light side Force users especially, need to train for a very long time to fight more powerful opponents, especially dark side users who gain power very quickly, but ultimately come up short against a Jedi that remains true to the light for the entirety of their training. 2. Legacy characters getting unceremonious ends in a timeline that did not demonstrate their actions having any lasting impact. Han dying like he did was disappointing, but Luke was what really set people off. He tries to kill his apprentice when he senses a hint of the dark side in him, whereas before he kept faith in his father when no one else did, even Obi-Wan and Yoda, who never gave up. And then he just dies. This set off lots of people, but after that, tons and tons of articles came out declaring the angry fans as man-babies and called them sexist, called them wrong for saying Rey is a Mary Sue, saying that Kelly Marie Tran leaving social media as proof that The Last Jedi hate is just racism, and all this left me in a very frustrated state regarding social issues. I still believed that racism was bad, and after George Floyd was killed, I saw how much of a problem it was and still is. I understood to a point that women were still treated bad by society, I just couldn't see it, and I believed that supporting gay rights was the right thing. But I also thought that Anita Sarkeesian and The Last Jedi were worthy of criticism, and ran the risk of turning people against legitimately good causes. So when I saw Captain Marvel, Doctor Who, Masters of the Universe Revelation, etc., all stirring up controversy for similar reasons, I became more frustrated, because I saw what they were doing as counterintuitive. They preached their causes, but they did some really drastic things with the lore of their respective franchises that alienated their fan bases. Okay, Captain Marvel didn't. It was much more Brie Larson's statements causing The Last Jedi backlash to latch onto the MCU after the fact, but my point still stands. And as a result, they were unnecessarily galvanizing their own opposition, and no one noticed that. I was in a lot of progressive YouTube spaces at the time, and none of them seemed to understand what was going on around all these pop culture franchises. Even when they would talk about them, all they ever seemed to say was, "Media has always been political. Get over it, you bigots." Around this time, every few months, some new entry in a big franchise or Disney remake would anger existing fans, and I became more and more frustrated. Then I discovered some channels who did seem to get it. They seemed to build a lot of their content around commentating on these franchises, and the disrespect shown to fans by the creators of them and the media at large. When I started watching their videos, it felt cathartic. These were people who cared about the franchises in question and understood that they were being appropriated and used by creatives who didn't care about them like the fans did, or at least that's how it looked at the time. They also claimed that this was part of a woke social justice political agenda, and at the time, I believed them, but only insofar as the creatives in question were misguided progressives who were unintentionally turning people against them. Then, on top of all that, there were also tons of statements from Kathleen Kennedy, president of Lucasfilm, and she went on and on about strong women working at the company, but there were also press releases that showed her fault, like how she forgot about the EU after she was the one who got rid of it. There was another one about Marsha Lucas saying that Kathleen Kennedy doesn't get it, but there was also one more where she announced a female-centric series later known as The Acolyte, and so those same YouTubers I mentioned before claimed that this was all part of a feminist agenda, and she is prepared to sacrifice the quality of the story and the legacy of the previous films to do so. That may sound ridiculous to you, and I explain it more in my Star Wars video, but if we just look at what happened, it is possible to draw a logical connection. What happened in the sequel trilogy? Main characters' achievements were basically reset from get-go, the Empire just came back in a different form, and the Jedi were nearly wiped out yet again. Rey broke pre-established rules around power escalation and the dynamic between light and dark Force users for seemingly no reason, other than to make her look awesome. Luke had all of his achievements stripped away from him. He loses his hope for the future and faith in his family, which were defining traits of his character in the original trilogy. The Jedi texts and Jedi legacy he spent so long protecting and rebuilding are destroyed, and then he just dies. As a bit of a side note, I've seen several people claim that The Last Jedi is actually great and does not deserve all the fan hate because it's the only part of the trilogy that had the courtesy to be different and try new things, while the other two movies and most of the Star Wars projects we've gotten since then have been far too safe, too samey, and too reliant on the connection to the existing timeline, kind of like the MCU right about now. The argument being that it gave them what they wanted, and the current state of the franchise is their fault for not liking The Last Jedi, for being new. So Disney has been making everything too safe now because of it. But this argument assumes a false binary of the same and different. You can have sequels take place in the same world and not make radical choices that tear the fanbase apart while doing something new. The Legend of Korra is a perfect example of this. Recognizably the same world, with several returning characters, but most of the story is about new conflicts that are only tangentially connected to the original series. The characters we know have changed since we last saw them, but not to the point of being unrecognizable. There's a lot of other examples, in fact this applies to most good sequels, but you get the picture. I was going to end the argument there, but then I watched this video by the book guy where he explained the difference between literary fiction and genre fiction. The former prioritizes artistic value above commercial appeal, and the latter is the opposite. Star Wars was created as genre fiction, and The Last Jedi is a lot closer to the literary fiction side of things. A person who enjoys one can certainly enjoy the other, but if you take an audience of people who are expecting to enjoy genre fiction and give them literary fiction instead, don't be surprised when a bunch of them are disappointed and or angry. It's not just that it was different. The creative intention is fundamentally incompatible. The point I'm getting at is this. Neither one is objectively better than the other. If you like or dislike one or both, that is completely fine. Your tastes are your own, your opinion is valid, and no one has the right to tell you otherwise. What you shouldn't do is take your opinion way too far, acting like you know what's best for the franchise, and saying that The Last Jedi haters are ruining the franchise by daring to dislike a movie that you think is objectively good, subversive, and bold. Or on the other side of things, saying it's the worst movie ever made, and that it ruined their childhood, and that Ruin Johnson should suffer. Both of those takes are ridiculous, stupid, and snobbish. In fact, the blame should really be placed on Disney for not being able to find a happy medium where a new story can be told without having to adhere to or defy existing lore and established character dynamics. Then more press releases came out from John Boyega and Daisy Ridley, revealing how there was no plan for the sequels. And then the Rage Engagement YouTubers just moved on to other things like Captain Marvel when Brie Larson said playing the character was her form of activism. Then a bunch of people with a bunch of other IPs started making questionable decisions, like Doctor Who, which erased the entire story of the Time Lords with an episode called The Timeless Child. Yes, I know Doctor Who has retconned its continuity before, but none of those stoked hate enough to spread to my circles, yet The Timeless Child did. Or how Masters of the Universe Revelation killed He-Man, the main character, in the first episode, and the focus was put on this female character named Teela. Then the media spoke again and decried fans as sexist and racist all over again every single time. Then the YouTubers responded and the rage continued. It's like the people handling the franchises and the media noticed the trend and were actively leaning into it for engagement. What started with Star Wars had basically turned into a controversy farm for the industry, the media, and the rage tubers. The industry and the media were basically giving the rage bait YouTubers ammo on a silver platter. This was also when the word woke started getting used more, and woke basically became synonymous with trashing the legacy of beloved franchises in the name of diversity. Unlike other people who made these types of videos about falling down the pipeline, I never really fell in completely, but I did regrettably dip my toes in with some YouTubers I'm ashamed to admit I followed the work of unironically. Midnight's Edge, Clownfish TV, Overlord DVD, No Bullshit, Yellow Flash 2, Geeks and Gamers was a channel I followed for a brief time. I even watched a video by The Critical Drinker about how canon actually matters and felt validated by it. To be fair, they weren't as overtly bigoted at the time, at least in videos that focused on Star Wars and the like. They only talked about how badly the legacy characters and the fans who liked them were treated. I believed them when they said that these creatives only cared about pushing an agenda and were prepared to ruin IPs if that's what it took. but as time went on and they ran out of these sorts of topics to make videos about, I started to see them for what they really were. I saw them rail against any mention of a character being gay, or racist policing being acknowledged. This confirmed for me at the time that they were really just bigots who were taking advantage of the situation. And upon realizing this, I started feeling alone. I felt like I was one of the only people on YouTube who both disliked The Last Jedi and believed in equal rights. I started feeling alienated when I watched YouTube and came across any mention of Star Wars. This may sound absurd now, but that's what it seemed like at the time, with the algorithm always promoting the most extreme takes. But around this time, something changed. Realizing the grifters for what they are was one major factor that pulled me out of the pipeline. The other major factor was discovering two LGBTQ YouTubers who believed in social justice causes, but weren't overtly hostile or willing to condemn the slightest thing in an instant. These creators were Cat Black and Council of Geeks. I discovered Cat Black years ago thanks to a video called Black Trans Woman Redesigned Safe Space and Snowflake. If you're not aware, Safe Space and Snowflake are two characters created as a part of a Marvel comic series called The New Warriors, and one of them is non-binary. At the time, they were criticized across the board by everyone, and Cat Black's video validated my thoughts at the time. But she was also my first exposure to the transgender community, outside of the mention of a gender transition or sex change getting brought up in a documentary or news story. I watched a few of her videos after that and learned a thing or two about trans issues. Council of Geeks, meanwhile, I had seen a few times before, and had heard them talk about being non-binary, but then I came across an old video of theirs called Stop Complaining About Wokeness in Entertainment. This video wasn't whiny or preachy or hostile, it was calm, reasonable, and logically thought through. It was also the first time that the importance of representation was actually explained to me in any capacity. Most other progressives I had seen since then just said it was important and expected everyone else to get with them. Shortly after this, I started watching more videos by Samantha Lux and Jamie Dodger, who taught me a lot about transitioning as a trans woman and a trans man, respectively, as well as other trans issues. Then, sometime after this, I started learning about asexuality and started thinking that I might be asexual. So I started doing some research and looked for personal experiences people had had about their own asexuality, and one of the first places I looked was on Council of Geeks. And sure enough, Vera had done a video on it. And with that knowledge in mind, and after some self-reflection and research, I realized that I definitely was asexual and demi-romantic on top of that. A few months later, I started questioning my gender, and here I am now. I've been on HRT for just over a year, and have been considering surgery. When I left college, I knew I wanted to make a booktube channel, since my gaming channel did not seem to be working out. This was after I finished The Wheel of Time, and as I was making my way through the last Percy Jackson universe, or Riordanverse as the fans call it, series. And I had my first experience with representation when I found out that Reina Avila Ramirez Arellano, a character introduced in the Heroes of Olympus, was written as asexual. This is only directly mentioned outside of the story, but actually reading the books, especially The Tyrant's Tomb, Rick's intentions were clear to me. I've talked about Reina before in this channel, about how validated it felt to see this aspect of my identity even acknowledged by an author who impacted my childhood so much, especially following the betrayal I felt shortly beforehand by a certain other author who must not be named. If you know, you know. During all this, I was aggressively following any news around the Wheel of Time show as it was getting made. And then it got revealed that some of the main characters who had been portrayed as white previously were going to be portrayed by black actors. This set off a lot of discourse in the Wheel of Time community on YouTube, but the biggest voices by those who actually care about the story spoke up and said skin color doesn't matter. And of course, when the show actually came out, people who complained about the show did so about other aspects of it. The thing is, because of all the pop culture franchises I had seen seized by people who didn't care about them and were fundamentally altered away from the original intent for the purpose of progressivism in a way that galvanized fan rage, thus pushing people towards toxic spaces I mentioned before, I legitimately thought they were going to change who the Dragon Reborn was for the show. Let me explain. The story of the Wheel of Time is, amongst many other things, the story of the Dragon Reborn, a hero who reincarnates through the ages to fight an evil god simply called the Dark One. Think the Avatar, but with much more time between reincarnation, and with a much more specific cosmic duty. In the books, it's obvious who this is very early on, but in the show, they decided to keep it ambiguous for most of Season 1. I was holding my breath for another great fan controversy until Episode 7 aired, which confirmed that no, the identity of the Dragon Reborn was not going to be changed for the show. Then, a couple years later, after I started my channel, the same thing happened with the Percy Jackson show casting. When I saw who was cast to play Annabeth, I instantly thought, here we go again, and I went from excited to worried that this would be the same type of fandom controversy as the Wheel of Time. And unfortunately, I was completely right for the most part. I even went back to watch Daniel Green and Matt Hatch's video on the Wheel of Time casting controversy, and it felt like deja vu. Fortunately, Rick noticed what was happening and stood up for Leah, which helped everyone calm down. But this was after I started my channel, and if you remember, I made my own video defending Leah. That video is terribly made by my current standards, and I've considered privating it as a result, but I still stand by almost everything I said in it. But as I made it, I did so in an attempt to show restraint. I specifically wanted to avoid accusing people of being racist if they didn't like it, and instead telling them that the casting was probably for the best. I was trying to win over people who might have fallen into the same rabbit hole of toxicity as me. Not because I had anything against diversity in the media I love, but because I was all too aware of choices getting made in the name of diversity that end up pissing fans off and counterintuitively turning people against diversity. In retrospect, I realized that implicit bias was also a major factor, like Rick pointed out in his statement on the casting. Fortunately, also like Wheel of Time, when the show actually came out, the acting was good, and people who criticized the adaptation, including myself, did so for other reasons. And in the years since the last major diversity controversy that made the news, all this seems to have died down. I no longer see major franchises with new entries like The Last Jedi or Masters of the Universe Revelation that made extreme decisions in the name of diversity, and the media dogpiling fans who criticize the new thing and calling them bigots. It does still happen on occasion, like with the first season of Rings of Power, but never to the same level of mainstream recognition that it did before. Then The Acolyte came out, and the actors started talking about the hate the show was getting, and it got cancelled, and the media started talking about it. I saw so much of the same old misunderstanding I was frustrated by back in the day, and I really wanted to make my Star Wars video ASAP. Then there was a massive wave of hateful comments in social media, then the mainstream media addressed that, and I realized that falling down a rabbit hole of hateful rhetoric was much more common than I thought, and I needed to share my experience in hopes of explaining it from the perspective of someone who almost fell in. That doesn't mean the issue of the industry rage farming has gone away though. The Acolyte, from when it was announced in mysterious fashion all the way up to its release, did garner a similar level of fan hate as some of the media I've talked about. Not as much as The Last Jedi, but enough that it was acknowledged by the mainstream media and the actors. The difference this time being that the show itself was not kicking up that much controversy. The hate against it primarily came from disgruntled former fans, who were already high in the rage engagement, no doubt galvanized by the previous controversy and media backlash as well as the rage-bait engagement farm of influencers. So instead of the show kicking up new controversy, the old one just latched onto it. This whole thing does seem to be dying, but the anti-woke influencers are still here and their audience is still watching them. So what do we do? Good question! To answer it, I believe we need to ask a different question that very few others have even acknowledged, and that question is the title of this video. Why are the woke so hated? That word has been so overused and misused that no one really agrees on what it actually means. But usually when it's used as a criticism, in my experience at least, it means socially progressive in a way that is actively hostile to the majority group. In the case of fiction, prioritizing the glorification of the marginalized group above the quality of the story and the integrity of the lore. And possibly putting down previously loved straight cis white male heroes. To those on the other side, that may seem like they are getting angry at nothing, but we need to remember that unless you're on the receiving end of it, oppression is often invisible, unless it's very blatant. This is why bigots dog whistle after all. Talk to any binary transgender person who passes as their preferred gender, and they will give you more insight into how differently men and women are treated than almost anyone else. And I speak from experience when I say that this applies to a lot more than just gender. If you're a young, straight, cis white man, even if your friends or family who are part of a marginalized group tell you about the discrimination they suffer, you probably don't fully understand how bad it is. So when you see someone acting like this,
feminists do not want you to lose custody of your children. The assumption that women are naturally better caregivers is part of patriarchy.
it sets a bad view of the cause in your mind. Or if you watched a movie that you happened not to like, or you saw a TV show take a turn that you happened not to like, and you see an article like this, again, it sets a bad view of the cause in your mind. Or more recently, if you see a character or universe you like get fundamentally altered in the name of progressivism, it probably makes you angry, especially if it's paired with the media claiming that disliking it is inherently bigoted. Now, I'll get to the effects of the algorithm on all of this later, but for now, I'd like to share my actual honest thoughts about Anita Sarkeesian. With the benefit of hindsight and actually checking out what she said in her videos in preparation for this video, I actually found myself agreeing with most of the points she was trying to make, but I'm also not a fan of the way she delivered those points. Even today, let me preface everything I'm about to say with the assertion that this video is not a condemnation of Anita Sarkeesian or any of her supporters. But for reasons that I'll explain, I personally disagree with how she went about doing what she did. She would say things like, the problem is not simply with using a damsel in distress trope, it's with how universal the trope is, or that you can still enjoy a piece of media despite being critical of it, or that seeing female characters get killed on screen doesn't necessarily turn someone into a violent misogynist. It's the ubiquity of it that influences social perceptions. She even talks about how men aren't given spaces to properly express themselves emotionally. These are all very valid takes, many of which I agree wholeheartedly with. I understand what she was going for. At least, I do now. And that's the problem. Anita's overall goal and claims are crystal clear to me after becoming an adult, and more importantly, after living as a member of multiple marginalized groups, those being asexual people and trans people. I understand how it feels to be reduced to a stereotype, and how the media can perpetuate stereotypes. Insert Emilia Perez joke here. But this wasn't always the case. That's why video essays take the time to explain things, to make sure everyone is on the same page, no matter what pre-existing knowledge they have, if any. But back when I first discovered her, it felt like she was making a mountain out of a molehill. This got compounded by the fact that she didn't use any positive examples in her videos. At least at first. So it looked like she was complaining about next to nothing and getting taken seriously for it. Later on in the series, she started using one or two positive examples to prove a point, but even then they weren't always good examples. Like in the Lady's Sidekick video when she uses cases like The Last Guardian, when that's a game that was clearly entirely built around the player's dynamic with Trico, something that isn't feasible for every game, especially those that only have a sidekick character for smaller gameplay sections. On top of that, there are also numerous cases where she claimed something that was a bit of a stretch at best, like how the presence of fridged characters makes the experience all about toxic masculinity and domination, even in the case of games with next to no story. Or infamously, when she argued that the option to kill a female character in Hitman promotes or trivializes violence against women, when it's an option on male NPC characters too, and it's something the game penalizes you for. Or times when she seemed straight up nitpicking, like when she argued that Zelda got captured right after changing into her usual outfit, a more feminine presentation in Ocarina of Time exemplified the idea that women are seen as less than. Or when she argued that something as minuscule and inconsequential as the sitting animations of the female guardian characters in Destiny, something you might not even see if you're playing the game, promoted negative feminine stereotypes. Which goes hand in hand with that infamous quote about how everything is problematic when you get right down to it. All of this feels like nitpicking and getting easily offended at the smallest of things, and then blowing those up to the level of big societal issues. Anita Sarkeesian, though well-intentioned and had many good points to make, in my opinion, did not properly explain to her audience the ideas she was expecting them to comprehend. There were also cases where something she said was clearly her opinion and not necessarily representative of the experiences of female gamers, like in the same video why Elizabeth and Ellie did not meet her standards of characterization. Though looking at that infamous quote of hers, "Everything is sexist, racist, and homophobic and you need to point it all out," I can kinda understand where she's coming from now. If you look at it the right way, it's possible for someone to find just about any work of art offensive for one reason or another, and if Anita wants to see the world that way, then she is free to do so. But that is just one interpretation from one feminist's perspective. Some other women, even other feminists, may disagree. It's impossible to please everyone after all. I do feel the need to reiterate here that my problem is not the points Anita was trying to make. It lies in how they were delivered. In one of her earlier videos, she says that men aren't given healthy ways to process their emotions, which like I said, is an important issue, but she doesn't use any counterexamples or ways that men could process their emotions better, and without that, her criticism is just a criticism, and I like to think there is a better way. Believe me, after seeing stereotypes of trans people as portrayed by the mainstream media, I wish that we could just be seen as normal. But when I explain the trans and aro-ace experiences to people, there are principles that I stick to. 1. If something can be interpreted as problematic, I do my best to give an even-handed take, giving the pros and cons. 2. If someone says or does something problematic, I always give them the benefit of the doubt, since by the nature of stereotypes, it's unlikely to have been done with malicious intent. 3. If something is blatantly problematic, I take a moment to explain why. The internet changes a lot of the dynamics of conversation when you say something to a large number of people who don't have to show their face. People from all over the world at that. I'm aware of how things can unintentionally come across as hostile on the internet, and that is not my saying that Anita's way is the wrong way to do it and my way is the right way. All I want to do here is explain the reasoning why I have the approach that I do, as informed by my experience growing up in the age of the internet. Editing Mythos here. I realized I forgot to explain something. Earlier in the video, I brought up Anita pointing to haters as evidence that her criticism was needed. And on her Twitter, she has a lot of tweets slamming and mocking her haters, and personally, I find this inadvisable. First and foremost, as any average internet user will tell you, hate usually comes from a vocal minority that do not necessarily represent the majority. This was even brought up to Anita in that clip from the Gamer from Mars's video that I mentioned before. Yet Anita does not seem to get this, which bothers me for another reason. In a recent video I made about J.K. Rowling's comments on International Asexuality Day, I talked about an online flame war I accidentally started that got one of the involved parties banned. Now, in the video, I used it as an example of how illogical fanaticism can be, especially for popular online creators, but there is another lesson I learned from that experience. Either of the creators in the flame war could have stopped the drama at any point. They had numerous opportunities to do so, and even points at which they did seemingly make up. And then one of them just started it up again. And they were acting like man-children the whole time, and this actively perpetuated the drama and made it worse, which resulted in one of the online creators getting harassed and banned. What I learned from that experience is that when dealing with online drama, it's best to just avoid it and de-escalate it when it does happen. And Anita does the opposite of this, which galvanizes her haters. I've seen people ask why Anita got so much hate for just surface-level feminism in the first place, and I believe it happened for a few reasons. One of which I already addressed, being that I don't think she explained it in a way that the average internet user who isn't already familiar with misrepresentations of underrepresented groups can understand. Or someone who isn't already familiar with the importance of representation and how it can affect our perceptions of underrepresented groups. But there are other reasons, and the way she talks about her haters is one of them. In my opinion, had she taken the time to properly explain the feminist ideas she was discussing in a way that people new to feminism could understand, or demonstrated more restraint and not coming across as so nitpicky, or demonstrated even-handedness and supplemented her negative examples with more positive ones from the beginning, people might have been more receptive and less offended. Because people on the outside don't see oppression, if you see someone going off the rails, it's easy to believe that they're just exaggerating. This, I believe, is the reason for the cognitive dissonance between Anita's supporters and her detractors, and by extension, me and my professor during our conversation, years before I even considered the possibility that I might not be straight or cis. Which brings me to my final point, and the thing I neglected to mention in my conversation with my professor about Anita Sarkeesian. That overzealous activism, and hers in particular, ran the risk of galvanizing its own opposition, making potential allies into enemies. This sort of thing was all over the culture war I discussed in my last video on this topic. Uninformed audience member sees an activist who claims to be fighting for a good cause and is calling out supposed bigotry that the audience member doesn't understand or flat out disagrees with, or just feels the activist is being too extreme, so they get angry at and join the opposition to the activist, which can lead them down a dark path. In my opinion, what Anita did was make feminism come across as nitpicky and accusatory, similar to the SJW freakouts that used to be popular on YouTube. And what the feminist filmmakers in my last video on this topic did was make feminism and progressive ideas in general seem like they were going to ruin beloved franchises, and the filmmakers would call fans bigoted when they criticized it. In both cases, the audience gets angry at the progressive and joins the opposition to them, which can lead them down a dark path. But how responsible exactly is Anita, the SJW freakouts, or even the filmmakers I discussed in my Star Wars video for the current state of the culture war? Honestly, none of them are the prime suspect for the bullshit that we're all in now. There are other factors, but there is one thing that all of these have in common, and that's the almighty algorithm. The algorithm promotes whatever gets the most engagement in order to maximize ad revenue, after all. And what does that better than online anger? Online drama, as I hope we're all aware, happens not necessarily because a fan base is toxic or bigoted, but because it's very big. And statistically, some of those people, a vocal minority most likely, are very loud and can make the drama seem bigger than it is. But regardless, engaging with the drama at all, especially anything expressing anger like a call-out, pours gasoline on the fire. Most of the time, it's best not to engage with online drama at all, lest you risk making it worse and having unintended consequences. Anita Sarkeesian did not seem to understand that, which is a bigger problem with her videos, because I can say with the benefit of hindsight that her videos made a lot of people angry. Also, a quick look across her personal Twitter and the Feminist Frequency Twitter has tons of callouts. Though her detractors certainly understand this, especially known scumbag Sargon of Akkad when he went to a panel Anita was on, knowing that if she noticed him, and she did, she would call him out, and he could then reap the attention and most likely ad revenue it would get him. Of course, Anita walked right into Sargon's trap. The algorithm has no sense of right and wrong, or whoever is technically correct. It only cares about whatever keeps people engaged and producing more ad revenue. So yes, like many video essays, especially those made by trans people, the overall point of this video is that capitalism is bad. All the figures I brought up here are factors in the online rise of the culture war. And not all major factors necessarily, though it's impossible to tell right now. I talked about Anita Sarkeesian, Kathleen Kennedy, and Brie Larson because they are the controversial figures that I am the most familiar with due to my experience, but there are others. While toxic content creators definitely deserve blame for the state of the culture war, they were all enabled by the algorithms of these social media platforms that people are on more and more, and that people depend on for news and information more and more. And until these platforms are run better and don't spread rage and misinformation as much, we need to understand that and act accordingly. And recently, someone actually managed to do that. Brie Larson, one of the key figures in the online culture war, when asked about angry male fans recently, completely dodged the question, saying it would tie her to something she doesn't want to be tied to, presumably because she figured out what was going on, how her statements were being used as fuel for the online culture war. And the interviewers were aware of this and were probably leaning into it. We need more people to do what she did. Be aware of what is going on and avoid fueling online rage. So with all of that established, this begs the question, what do we do about it? Well, I've actively tried to break the whiny woke SJW stereotype since it was Cat Black and Council of Geeks breaking the stereotype that helped me escape the pipeline. And we need to show people, cishet white men included, that we are not their enemy. We need to show them that we have something to offer them that's worth having. The internet promoting the most angry takes and polarizing perspectives has left us divided, but those takes did not come from nowhere. In this video, thus far, I've discussed how people uninformed can be turned against activists if the activist comes off as too extreme. But there is another common thread here from the other side. People from marginalized groups, or people who support them, expressing their anger. I want to say here that I empathize with that. When society makes it very clear they don't care what happens to you and they don't care if the bigots try to erase you from society, it justifiably makes you angry. Furious even. And if I'm being honest, a lot of recent events have made me disappointed in humanity. And we've seen over and over again that seeing someone else, even on the other side of the screen, who shares your anger, especially if it's been repressed, is validating. I've been in that position myself. I've had bouts of rage that make me want to get up and shout. amongst other things. But anecdotally, I'd say there's more than enough evidence at this point to suggest that rage-driven online call-out culture is not the solution. I know it's satisfying to see a takedown of something you hate. I know it's satisfying to see a defense of something you love. Human beings naturally gravitate towards what already agrees with them. That's how echo chambers form, and that's how polarization is created. I can tell you from personal experience that as I began seeing the rage grifters for what they are, I wanted to move towards progressive spaces, but whenever I did, I always felt anxious because I thought I would be blasted for disliking The Last Jedi, amongst the other films released around that time. The mass fan-shaming done by the media had created the impression in my head that that was the common attitude held by progressives. I believed that they were the type of people you needed to walk on eggshells around, or they would condemn you for the most minor expression of dissent. Only after I decided to just speak up anyway and be as even-handed as I could did I realize this was not the case. I realized that progressives aren't searching for offense for the most part, they're just regular people. And as such, I was able to fully embrace those communities. And in turn, they accepted me. Instead, I recommend honest communication in a way that understands its audience and can explain issues even to the most uninformed people. Even as I say that though, there's something else I need to mention, and that's men's mental health. Our society still stigmatizes acknowledging it, especially for men, since it's seen as unmanly by toxic masculine standards. If what I said about uninformed audience members didn't make it clear, we also ought to consider things from their perspective before we form judgment. Thankfully, people are starting to realize the relevance of this topic in general. I focused on Star Wars and the subsequent pop culture backlash in my previous video on this topic, and other culture war topics like Anita Sarkeesian and the diverse casting disagreements in this video, because I've been able to introspect a lot about my experience with all of them. And while they are certainly factors in the anti-woke movement, they are far from the only ones or even the most impactful, arguably. I didn't even touch on the manosphere, a bunch of older men high on toxic masculinity that preach about it to insecure young men, which causes them to fall down a dark path. And that one was big enough to get mainstream attention and to get examined in the Netflix series Adolescence, which takes a hard look at the effects of those caught in it. But if you'll indulge me for just a bit longer, I'd like to talk about my experience with gender for just a moment. I've never dove deep into the specifics of my gender identity, but I identify as bigender, which is a non-binary identity composed of two other identities. In my case, the masculine and the feminine, which is the most common one that I know of. Growing up, I never had as big of a problem with masculinity as other trans feminine folks. I never hated being a boy, and to this day, I don't get much dysphoria from being called he or him or sir or brother or son. Many of my tastes and attitudes are what you would call stereotypically masculine, but I never really liked anything that was hyper-masculine, like playing as barbarian characters in RPGs, or football, or hanging out with a bunch of older men. I also had a liking for some things that were stereotypically feminine, like what you would call pretty outfits, princesses, and of course, mermaids. Lots and lots of mermaids. I would look at certain pieces of women's clothing, and then I became envious. As in, I wished I could wear them, thinking the male alternatives were generic and boring. I also did dance and theater at my local art center a lot as a kid, and that's a field that was very female-dominated. In the last few years, we got a new dance director who encouraged more boys to learn to dance, but for most of my time there, I was often the only, air quotes, boy, and most of the teachers were women. So of course, this gave me cause to interact with them, and I came to see girls and women as people not too different from myself. This, I think, inoculated me against the worst of the pipeline. I was also aro-aspec, though I did not know it at the time, so getting a girlfriend was never really a priority for me. When I started recognizing these strange feminine tendencies I had had since I was very young, it was terrifying at first, but letting myself express a bit of femininity was also a source of joy, even if it was in secret. I also realized that I was comfortable in female-dominated spaces, outside of just the dance floor. Hence why, after cycling through a few labels, I eventually landed on bigender. I've seen other trans people, even binary trans people, with varying views of their assigned gender at birth. Sometimes they never connected with it, and sometimes they consider living under another identity a valuable experience because it gave them a different perspective. A different perspective that most people don't have. And if it wasn't obvious, I fall into the latter category. And this is why I empathize with the struggles of young men in our society who may not fit the role that was given to them by said society. You could say that's because I'm still at least partially masculine, it's just that now I'm recognizing my feminine side. And as such, I empathize with the young men who felt like they were treated unfairly, and even those who fell down the pipeline. Having dipped my toes in out of frustration with progressive activists, and how they talk about young men. But I'm both aro A-spec and trans non-binary, and I understand the struggles of being a part of said groups. So I felt like I had to at least try and reach out to both sides and help them understand each other with whatever I can offer by sharing my experience. So if you're a progressive who has made it this far, all I have to say to you is this. Try to understand the young men who have fallen in with the wrong crowd. Not necessarily to empathize with them, but to understand what motivated them to take the plunge. Politics and the algorithms have led to a lot of polarization and division, but understanding is the first step to bridging the divide. If what I've said here has given you a new perspective, maybe consider checking out my Star Wars video if you haven't already for a more in-depth look at the controversy that almost radicalized me. If you want more, a ton of other YouTubers have made videos about this. Sean has a video diving into the mindset of these sorts of people made several years ago. Dark Matter 2525 made a fantastic video about his fall into a similar situation as me and how he got out. Shanspear dives into the manosphere and a lot of problems with modern masculinity. FD Signifier created a career based on deconstructing the manosphere. And Pillar of Garbage has a whole series about the current grifters and how everything is far more connected than we realize at first. I don't watch all of their content, nor do I agree with everything they say, but these videos explain a lot of this issue from the perspective of people who either fell into a bad pipeline or those who studied it. And for any young men who don't really understand what progressives or people from marginalized groups are fighting for, try to find a member of said group who can explain things in a manner you can understand. Speaking as a member of the LGBTQ community, believe me when I say we love to share our experiences. Trans people like myself would love to share our experience with gender as a social phenomenon over just being surgeries and controversy to the public. And if you want advice about talking to girls, while I can't give you advice on getting a date, I can give you a bit of advice on how to start. Step 1. Always remember to be polite and respectful. Don't come across as too pushy. If she doesn't want to do something, don't press her. Step 2. Consider starting by talking about a common interest you both may have. That's just good advice in general for starting conversations as an introvert. Step 3. Just remember that women are people too, not nearly as different from yourself as you may think. They too have lives, hopes, struggles, and dreams. And if you've got something you want to pursue that is considered too girly for young men, just do it anyway. Do what makes you happy as long as you aren't hurting anyone, even if it makes you uncomfortable at first. It could be something that brings you a lot of joy, even if you're cisgender. And if you've got a lot of pent-up feelings that society has told you to just suck up, don't. Take it from someone with anxiety, depression, and ADHD. Never bottle up or repress your feelings. The outcome is not pretty. Acknowledge and understand your feelings, and maybe get help from someone. Maybe a friend or a family member, maybe a professional if you really need it. But for now, that's all for me. This video is very different from what I usually make, so please let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. I'd love to hear from a different perspective regarding this topic. And thank you so much for watching this long. I'm Kylan Mythos, and I'll see you all next time. For all our delight in the impermanent, the entrancing flicker of electronics, we also long for the unalterable. So people turn to the realms of fantasy for stability, ancient truths, immutable simplicities. And the mills of capitalism provide them. Supply meets demand. Fantasy becomes a commodity, an industry. Commodified fantasy takes no risks, it invents nothing, but imitates and trivializes. What the commodifiers of fantasy count on and exploit is the insuperable imagination of the reader, child or adult, which gives even these dead things life, of a sort, for a while. I've lost most of my faith in the film industry at this point, and I know I'm not alone in that. The film industry releases movie after movie, franchise after franchise, and they continue to frustrate fans and creatives alike. Or they fail to make bank, or both. One significant past success and the company milks it for all it's worth. Or they buy every existing mega franchise they can, and again, milk it for all it's worth. Or, worse yet, they revive or remake an existing franchise because money. The film industry has always done this, but in recent years, it has completely taken over to the point where it feels like every single movie and show getting released is an attempt at furthering an existing franchise. The big issue this creates is that the new pieces of media tend to suck. Star Wars is one of the worst cases of this, with so many new shows, comics, books, and whatever else constantly getting churned out. It's honestly no wonder the quality has declined. The few new IPs that either get created or adapted get little to no advertising or merch, and they have a tendency to flop through no fault of their own and never get a chance to shine. I honestly don't know which fate is worse, dying before being given a chance or succeeding and getting drained of creativity. But there is one fate that's definitely worse than either of those. A new movie or show comes out that divides the fan base. Thus, the internet lights on fire, and all the discussion becomes about the fandom being toxic, and possibly insert your preferred discriminatory word here. Last year, I made a video about one of those fan wars, specifically regarding the Star Wars fandom, and how it connected to the larger culture war, which I expanded on in another video I made a few months ago. But this video isn't about that. This time, I'm expanding on a topic I wanted to include in my original Star Wars video, and that's, what respect do we really owe fan bases in this day and age? What respect do we really owe creatives in this day and age? I'm sure you've all got your own answers to this question, but I wanted to explore it a bit more. Because even with those two other videos totaling around 2 hours, I still did not talk about all the fandom divisions I've bore witness to. Some of them are for IPs I myself am not a fan of, but thanks to my following various YouTubers who are fans, I've become aware of more of these fan wars than I ever expected, and in all of this, I've noticed a few recurring patterns, and I'd like to talk about those today. But in order to explain drama in the fandom, we need to understand the other side of the equation, that being the industry and all its problems. In the past couple of decades, we've seen every single mainstream franchise with any level of success get revived, rebooted, and spun off of in every which way. With rare exceptions like Back to the Future, for now at least, almost every mainstream franchise has been milked to death. Jurassic Park, Alien, Terminator, Lord of the Rings, thanks Hobbit movies. Even some much older films you probably didn't know became franchises with sequels and reboots like Home Alone and Die Hard. Some have justified sequels better than others, and while the movies always vary in quality, one thing remains certain. Make enough movies, and eventually, they will suck, possibly harming the narrative of the original film as well. This kind of milking is not new. Unnecessarily continuing films into massive franchises to the detriment of the narrative has been done for decades. While this has always been the case, it has gotten much worse in recent memory. Franchises are all the industry can put out nowadays. So where does that leave newer creatives or authors who want their work adapted to the screen? Opportunities for such a creator to tell their stories are fewer than they used to be. Corporations are just relying more and more on existing IP, and as such, artists have to latch onto an existing franchise to make anything at all. So what do you do when you're only allowed to tell someone else's story but you want to tell your own? You change that someone else's story to fit your vision. This might be the reason so many unfaithful adaptations get made. Brandon Sanderson has talked about an adaptation of one of his stories, The Emperor's Soul, getting conceptualized in a screenplay. The Emperor's Soul, if you're not aware, is a very small-scale story, the vast majority of which takes place in a single room. In the screenplay he was later handed was a globe-trotting, monster-fighting fantasy adventure set, in the author's words, in a world that was completely unrelated to mine. Sanderson theorizes that because of how Hollywood works, basing your new story off an existing idea, or at least pretending you are, is the only way to get it greenlit, unless you're already a huge name in the industry. But then that screws over the author and fanbase of that original work. And even if you get writers, a director, and executives to agree to a faithful adaptation, there's a chance enough things will go wrong and the project will be cancelled in development hell. My favorite example of this is Bone. If you're not aware, Jeff Smith's fantasy epic is considered one of the greatest graphic novels ever to be made in North America. There was a time during my childhood when these books were everywhere, and people still talk about them today. Yet, he's failed to get it adapted 3 separate times. Nickelodeon, Warner Bros., and most recently Netflix all talked to him about it, but all of them canceled it or turned it down. But even then, even if you get your idea or adaptation greenlit, even if you have enough creative control to make sure it matches your vision, even if no other outside interference occurs, even if it comes out exactly the way you want it, there's a chance you won't be able to finish it. In the past few years, I've noticed, especially when it comes to animated movies and shows, corporations not doing much in the way of advertising for some new IP or new adaptation, and not creating any merch for it. And then it flops and gets cancelled after 1 movie, or sometimes 2 to 3 seasons of a TV show at best. My favorite example of this, at least in the past year, is The Wheel of Time. Amazon pushed the first season with a lot of advertising, trying to make the next Game of Thrones, but this declined over the course of the series until season 3, which got significantly less promotion, and after it aired, was rated 97% fresh and was praised up and down by fans for its faithful adaptation of the source material, including myself. It got cancelled. It reportedly had similar numbers to Rings of Power while costing a lot less, by the way. I've even seen fans point out how this model of television would have prematurely killed series before they hit their stride. Even series we now consider to be industry juggernauts like Star Trek The Next Generation. And that's only one example from one company. In the past, I thought Disney's treatment of the Owl House was due to its LGBTQ content. But I'm not so sure after looking into it. Other Disney cartoons like The Ghost and Molly McGee and Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur have gotten this sort of treatment as well. No official merch, very little promotion, and both of them were cancelled after 2 seasons. And they didn't even get 3 special episodes to close the story out, like The Owl House. And The Owl House probably only got those because it gained massive popularity through word of mouth, despite the lack of advertising. And of course, this applies to the movie industry as well, especially when it comes to animation. You all have probably heard of Elio flopping earlier this year for similar reasons as Elemental initially flopped 2 years ago. Little marketing, and what we did get was pretty bad. All while Disney put out tons of marketing for the Lilo and Stitch remake. Elemental may have recovered from its initial failure, but that doesn't seem to have impressed the executives, and not every good animated movie can do that. Transformers 1 certainly wasn't able to do it. That movie had terrible marketing, but it's genuinely good. It did so many things that just worked for the Transformers franchise, and it could have led to a series of great movies. But that idea never got off the ground. You could attribute some of this to the state of the franchise Michael Bay left it in, but not all of it. And don't even get me started about Warner Bros. And how they treated the day the Earth blew up, and how they tried to lock up Coyote vs. Acme so no one would ever be able to see it. But my favorite example is Ruby Gillman Teenage Kraken from DreamWorks. I've hinted at it before, but I've got a real soft spot for this movie. I love the stylized, squishy, noodly animation, the breathtaking underwater scenes, and I love its endearing title character. Ruby is one of my all-time favorite DreamWorks characters. The only reason she isn't my absolute favorite is because of the impact Hiccup and Toothless had on me when I was growing up. Ruby is anxious, shy, overthinks everything, but she's compassionate and determined when she needs to be. That moment during the film when she gets into the water, knowing what's going to happen to her, genuinely touched me as a trans person in a way almost no other scene in any other piece of media has. But thanks to its terrible marketing that gave away the entire plot of the movie and focused too much on its mishandled message about prejudice that was cringe and had very little to do with the actual story, the movie flopped hard. Though it did have enough positive press for a brief success on Netflix, I'm not holding my breath for anything else. Yes, the movie told a complete story, but much like Rise of the Guardians, there is so much more you could do with this world and characters. I've seen people rag on this movie for it mishandling its ideas about prejudice, but Ruby never falls into that mindset. In fact, she really goes against it.
Now, what about the mermaid? Everyone likes fried fish.
No.
Away, Rage.
Teenagers. Away, Rage.
But even as I defend the movie, I admit it really should have done more to explore this particular topic, considering how important it is to the story. Which could be done in a sequel, or dare I say it, a Netflix series? But again, I'm not holding my breath. Because that's the industry we have these days. No risk-taking, nothing new. Even when something new does come along, it probably dies very quickly. This is a huge issue I admittedly don't have the answer to. For now, the best I can come up with is be careful what you invest your time and your hard-earned cash in. Personally, I'd advise investing more in media that's outside the mainstream, and/or is handled by a single creative. This is actually a major reason why I started a book/comic channel to talk about my favorite novels, comics, manga, and their adaptations, including anime, because they are all predominantly single stories told from a single creator's vision. There's also indie animation, amongst other things. Most of you probably know about Glitch Productions, Vivzy Pop, and Pretty Please I Don't Want to Be a Magical Girl, though if you haven't heard about that last one, I highly recommend it. I'd also like to shout out a couple of lesser-known projects, Pieces of Powder and Sirenetta Part-Time Mermaid, though with the latter, not all of it is good, and you really should start with a family dinner short film. But even as I bash the mainstream media, I admit it does serve a purpose. Big-name movies and shows can bring everyone together. They're like major cultural shifts that shake up the whole industry and probably introduce a lot of people to something they've never seen before. But again, be careful what you invest in. And I'd seriously advise against following a story in any medium past its natural endpoint. That movie trilogy that had a complete story told in a trilogy that hasn't gotten a new entry in the better part of a decade getting a fourth movie is probably a bad sign. That TV show that wrapped up all of its plot threads and character arcs in 1, 2, or 3 seasons continuing may not be better for it. So, coming back to the industry today, newsflash, business-minded people don't understand or care about creativity, and they are terribly short-sighted. It's gotten worse as time has gone on and the industry has become more capitalistic, and inevitably in their careless attitude towards the franchises they handle, someone is going to make a mistake. Because the story continued past its natural endpoint and recycled the same plot over and over again, or people forget what the original story really was and it becomes something unrecognizable. Or worst of all, someone who doesn't care about the existing story or the fans has their own vision they want to bring to life, and they get complete control of it. Remember what I said about Brandon Sanderson in the Emperor's Soul screenplay? I would try to ask the question of what would happen if the globetrotting unfaithful adaptation had succeeded, if it weren't for the fact that I don't have to imagine it. Because I've seen this exact sort of thing happen with so many IPs from the mainstream to the niche. It's not pretty, and that's to say nothing of the effect it can have on the fans. Fandoms have become more and more of a popular talking point even in the mainstream media in the past decade or so, and not for good reasons. Fanbases used to be a community you could be a part of if you wanted to connect with other fans of a particular IP. And while fanbases getting angry wasn't unheard of before the 2010s, it's gotten much more prevalent since then. There have been many reasons for this, the biggest one being studios constantly pumping out new pieces of media. Usually this results in fanbases either liking the new thing, or they kind of like it but don't think it needed to exist, or some fans like it but other fans viscerally dislike it. This leads to a little phenomenon I like to call fandom division, which is easily the worst kind of fandom drama. Over the past decade or so, I've seen fanbases become toxic for a number of reasons, be it obsessive power fantasy, thinking one story is superior to all others because of subversion or snobbery, shipping disagreements, etc. But when it comes to fans being fiercely divided, I've noticed a recurring pattern. If people near universally hate something, the drama eventually dies down as they run out of things to say about it. But if there is a substantial number of people on both sides, love and hate, they can be constantly putting out arguments and responding to each other, creating a feedback loop. Thus, drama can last much longer, years on end, until something else comes along to take their attention. Star Wars is easily the most infamous case of this, and undeniably the absolute worst, as I still see people ranting about The Last Jedi, even though it's been almost a decade. I've already talked about the Star Wars fan drama enough on this channel, so I'll be brief here. George Lucas handed Disney and Kathleen Kennedy an outline for the sequel trilogy when he sold the rights, but Disney discarded it and decided to make their own. The Force Awakens came out directed by J.J. Abrams, and it felt like a retreading of A New Hope. But then The Last Jedi came out 2 years later, directed by Rian Johnson, who, according to Mark Hamill, went in with the attitude of not caring about what the fans wanted and only thinking about what he was making. This resulted in The Last Jedi taking a hard left turn into another dimension from where J.J. Abrams and what George Lucas were trying to do. And that lit an internet firestorm hotter than the lava of Mustafar. Eventually, some YouTube grifters found statements from Kathleen Kennedy about promoting strong women in Star Wars, along with a statement where she forgot about the EU, and a statement from Marsha Lucas, editor of the original trilogy, who said that while she likes Kathleen Kennedy and J.J. Abrams, quote-unquote, they don't get it, specifically highlighting Han Solo dying amongst other things. The grifters took Kathleen's statements about promoting strong women in Star Wars and her incompetence to mean she was injecting a feminist agenda into Star Wars, and she didn't care that she was ruining the story and beloved male characters to do so. Then, other creatives said things that made it super easy to complain about and cry woke agenda, like Brie Larson saying that she saw playing Captain Marvel as her form of activism, or Leslie Headland saying she was going to make The Acolyte about identity politics. And the grifters were given low-hanging fruit to continue the grift and grow dramatically, causing the fan rage to continue and spread to other franchises like Doctor Who, Masters of the Universe, and Lord of the Rings. There's more to it than that, see these videos for details. I am not recapping it all here. This is easily the biggest case of fandom division and the one I have the most personal investment in, but there are others I didn't talk about in my previous 2 drama retrospectives because I felt they weren't part of the same issue, but they are part of the discussion for this video. The first one, of course, being DC, specifically the Snyderverse and everything else. Now, DC has been around a while, and it has tons and tons of fans across many mediums, with comparable cultural impact even to Star Wars, but mainstream films tend to have an impact greater than most other forms of media by orders of magnitude. The only exceptions being extremely popular TV shows like Game of Thrones or The Walking Dead. Comics, cartoons, books, and even direct-to-video animated movies are all niche in comparison to big theatrical releases. Hence, despite existing for much less time than the rest of DC media, with way fewer entries, Snyder fans are numerous enough to be a significant part of the conversation, even 4 years after the Snyder Cut. The point of division here being how Zack Snyder portrayed key characters like Superman and Batman, compared to how they are portrayed in most other appearances, including more recent appearances. Batman is easy to explain. He doesn't kill, and that includes doing everything he can to prevent death by inaction, even if that means not killing the Joker. But the best example, much like Luke Skywalker, is Superman. Superman in most other portrayals does everything he can to prevent destruction and death because he is usually the only one with the power to do it. He'll go out of his way to save a cat from a tree, or take the hit of a kaiju attack to save one person, all while instilling a sense of hope in people. In Man of Steel, he's either emotionless or angry, and he doesn't seem to care if buildings fall on other people. But it's dark and edgy, so some people, presumably teenagers and/or people who had never had too much exposure to other Superman stories, latched onto it, seeing it as their thing, and they get angry when they see the DCEU moving in a different direction, under James Gunn, even if said different direction is returning to what Superman and other heroes originally stood for. I'm surprised, but not that surprised by how toxic the Snyder fandom has been. Despite James Gunn and Zack Snyder respecting each other, they see James Gunn's Superman movie as a personal attack on the story that they love, and have campaigned every bit as hard as your average Last Jedi hater to take down the new Superman film. But it didn't work, obviously, and they're salty about it to the point of absolute denial. Thankfully, we have a mainstream Superman adaptation that's made by someone who loves the character in his original form and wanted to do it justice. To, from what I understand, great success. I have a few more divided fan bases I'd like to discuss, but these next 2 are a bit different, in that they are book series that both got big budget adaptations, rather than a new mainstream entry. The Wheel of Time and Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Now, Percy Jackson fans were already a bit insufferable before the show came out, and I say that as a Percy Jackson content creator who considers the greater connected universe, known as the Riordanverse by fans, as their favorite book series. I have my reasons as to why I no longer go to r/Camp Half-Blood, even before the show came out. The Wheel of Time fandom, on the other hand, was easily the best fandom I had ever interacted with prior to the release of the Amazon Prime show. At the time, I suspected that it had to do with the older demographic of the books and the amount of dedication it takes to finish the series. But after a few episodes of each of their respective streaming series adaptations, both fan bases hit the roof. Now, it's bad in the Percy Jackson fanbase, toxic fanbase ranting even over a year after the first season. I've seen even some people make videos about it, and how disappointed they are in the fandom. But all things considered, it isn't as bad as other fandom divisions I've talked about, though that's primarily because the general opinion of the show by the fandom is that it's deeply flawed, but overall still good, partly due to the first season ending on a high note. The Wheel of Time fandom, on the other hand, has not been so lucky. I've defended The Wheel of Time on Prime since before Season 3 turned out to be an absolute masterpiece and one of the best adaptations I've ever seen. And honestly, I don't think the show was ever that bad, but blood and bloody ashes! A few episodes into the first season, and this fanbase became the worst fanbase I've ever seen aside from Star Wars and arguably the Snyder Bros. Many fans absolutely despised the show and very quickly created separate spaces for show haters, flooded the comments section of every single promotional video released by Amazon on YouTube, and even left some angry comments on videos released years ago and have nothing to do with the show. Viciously attacked anyone who dared talk about the show in any capacity, or anyone who dared call them out on their overtly toxic behavior, and what it was doing to the fandom. Defending their actions as just being disappointed, and of course, celebrating when the show got cancelled earlier this year. They even have a separate fandom nickname that caught on better than any of the whole fandom nicknames. If you don't know, the Wheel of Time fandom tried to name itself something like how Star Trek fans are called Trekkies and how Doctor Who fans are called Whovians, but names like Wheelies and Dragonsworn never really caught on, and I never hear about them nowadays. But when show fans started calling the haters Book Cloaks, it caught on very well. Book Cloaks, for those who have not read the Wheel of Time books or seen the show, is a reference to the Children of the Light, also known as the White Cloaks. They are, to be blunt, religious fanatics who kill anyone that goes against their worldview and their beliefs about the Creator, which is anyone with some sort of magic or anyone who disagrees with them too much. The White Cloaks have a tendency to execute such people without a fair trial. I only started seeing the term Book Cloak catch on recently, and every Wheel of Time fan instantly knows what it means. Yet I only heard terms like Wheelies and Dragonsworn sparingly, even right after they were first created. The nickname for the adaptation haters caught on better than the nickname for the fandom ever did. This is the only time I've seen that happen, and it's a bad sign. Phew. Okay, only one more of these to really look over. My last example is a video game fandom, which is very different in terms of how fans interact with them, but they carry a lot of the same patterns as the other fandoms I've talked about. Paper Mario. I haven't really played any of these games aside from a minute or two at best, and watching my dad play Super for a little while, but I've become all too aware of the division this fandom has seen thanks to YouTubers like Arlo. In recent memory, I have also watched Chugga Conroy's Let's Play of the first game, so I think I understand the appeal. I'll simplify what I can here. For those not in the know, Paper Mario was a series that started all the way back on the N64 in the year 2000. It was known as Mario Story in Japan and was basically a turn-based RPG that was made to feel like a storybook. It was more slowly paced compared to other Mario games and even other Mario RPGs like Mario and Luigi. There were different moves you need to perform against certain enemies, and partners with their own abilities that were useful in certain situations. Speaking of the partners, each of them was a fully developed character with personality, goals, and a whole story arc you play through before they permanently join the team. Speaking of which, the game also did a lot to flesh out the Mushroom Kingdom and its various locales and citizens. Each place you visit is as fleshed out as your average town in a Legend of Zelda game, with a place in the world, characters with personality, societal roles, and even connections to other characters in other parts of the world. It's not Xenoblade levels of depth, but it's charming and enjoyable in its own way. It also got a sequel called Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door, which fleshed out the world, characters, and gameplay even more than the first game, but it was on the GameCube, which did not sell all that well, especially compared to the competition. Then Super Paper Mario came out on the Wii, and it was mostly a departure from what the series originally was in terms of gameplay, but it still had a dark and compelling story and characters. Then we get the most infamous game in the series, and one of the most hated video game sequels I've ever seen, but haven't played. Paper Mario Sticker Star, which had a terrible story, very little character, a cast of mostly regular toads, and some of the stupidest game design decisions I've ever seen. revolving around collecting disposable items you need to attack, and picking up specific objects that are easy to miss but absolutely required to beat the game, like we're back on the NES. Then, Paper Mario Color Splash came out on the Wii a few years later, and it was better than Sticker Star, containing less stupidity in its game design, but it still lacked a compelling story and characters, and it kept the combat system revolving around disposable attacks, and once again, it was widely panned. This was how the drama got on my radar. Then, a few years after that, we got Paper Mario the Origami King, which was even closer to the first two games in terms of story and character, but tried a radically different style of combat and still didn't have anything resembling the RPG and partner system of the first two. This time there were a decent number of people who liked the new game, so this led to division in the same song and dance we're used to at this point. The old fans criticized the new thing, fans of the new thing, particularly newer fans who haven't gotten as much chance to play the first two games, at least until the Thousand Year Door remake and NSO changed that, which led to internet shouting matches that continued in a feedback loop for years, and would latch on to anyone that even mentioned Paper Mario on social media. Thankfully, things have calmed down in recent memory with the Thousand Year Door remake. So with all that being said, when you line them all up, we tend to notice similar threads they all share despite how different all these fan wars may be. Each of these cases, regardless of medium, had a major new adaptation, a mainstream edition in the case of big franchises, and the new piece of media did not match the original creative vision for the franchise, either intentionally or accidentally, but it had its own creative vision, and just had the existing franchise slapped on over it, so it gained its own fan base. And because there are two conflicting visions in the same franchise, each with its own fanbase, division starts to arise from there. There is a bit of an exception regarding the two adaptations I discussed, but adaptations are fundamentally separate entities from their source material, and the changes made when adapting a story are often necessary, and they're never going to please everyone, so the division was in some ways inevitable, but some of the decisions made still could have been better. Fundamentally, fans are people with investment, usually emotional investment in something. When people are invested in something, no matter what it is, they want to protect their investment. In the case of fan division, seeing people enjoying the new thing or the old thing if you're on the other side is seen as a threat to your investment because more people enjoying the thing you don't like is incentive for the IP holder to make more things like it. So to protect your investment, assuming you don't have the maturity to just let it go, which, let's be real, describes a lot of people on the internet, you Twitter fight anyone who likes the other thing and probably end up hurting the fan space, because respecting other people's opinions or just not caring means death of the franchise you love. And the fallout of this drama can be anything from mass harassing to lots of people getting banned. So, how should we handle this? Well, speaking as a YouTuber and an aspiring storyteller, when I put one of these passion projects together, it's an endeavor. I don't think people on the outside realize the blood, sweat, and tears that go into creating a story, an art piece, or even a YouTube channel. And even what I've done is pretty minuscule compared to what many professionals have done. And as a fan of various IPs, I feel like I appreciate the work of creatives a lot more, attempting some creativity myself. Fan bases are large groups of people with emotional investment in something. Creatives also have emotional investment in what they create, so much so that they bring it into existence when no one else cares. And when you've invested so much of your life into something, you want to protect it, or more accurately, you want it respected. And you wouldn't want it to be put in control of someone who won't respect it and protect it as you made it as a creator, or as you came to love it as a fan. This might sound a bit controversial, and I'll explain this point more in a little bit, but I believe we ought to respect the original vision for the franchise. I know that a ton of you are about to send me a million counter-arguments, but hear me out. Try to put yourself in the creator's position. If you've spent a significant portion of your life on something, you want it to matter. You want people to see it. And someone taking that away from you and using it for their own purpose is going to feel like a betrayal. If you're a fan, assuming you have the maturity to not start internet fights, what do you do if something that was a part of your life, and maybe something you shared with friends or family, becomes something you aren't enjoying the way you used to? You let it go. Sometimes it's a natural end point, but if there is going to be more, if a story is interrupted before it's finished, then it robs you of the ending you would have received. More on this later. Despite that, I will add the caveat that you shouldn't bend knee to all fan desires either. Art must be created with a creative vision. Otherwise, it's going to turn out soulless. And again, knowing what changes to make with adaptations is difficult. Now, if you still don't believe me or think I'm crazy for even suggesting the idea that original creatives and fandoms deserve respect, let's try a little thought experiment. Let's pretend for a moment that you love Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's one of your favorite shows and pieces of media of all time. You love its characters, its themes, and its world. You've rewatched it numerous times throughout your life. Then one day you see the news that there's going to be a new Avatar series, and you're excited and you find out it's about a female main character, which is a change you're okay with. So you follow the news leading up to the release of the show. The show comes out and it's not what you expected. Before it starts, Aang had a falling out with his friends, and he abandoned them along with all his Avatar duties and his no-kill rule, aspects that basically defined his character in the original show. The Fire Nation restarted the war and is once again nearing victory. The lore has been rewritten, and now spirits are not beings deeply tied to nature with morality that's difficult for humans to grasp. They're either good or evil, and the evil ones need to be fought against. The new female lead is not a new Avatar, but some other person who bonded with a spirit and can bend all four elements. But she didn't need to track down a master of each one and train diligently, or even put in the effort to understand each element and what they individually stand for. Yet she's somehow a master of all four and is able to go toe-to-toe with powerful opponents. She's also pretty emotionless and maybe even a little angry. Existing characters from the previous show are there, but not for very long. In fact, they often feel like they've had their character arcs reset. Oh, and some of them end up dead. Needless to say, you're not just disappointed, you're straight up pissed that the writers would lure you in with the possibility of a new Avatar show only to dash your hopes and make you feel cheated for being invested, and angry with how your favorite characters were treated. So you go to the internet, and you see that the general consensus is that the fans are just being toxic and even misogynistic. Fan complaints tend to be about how the new main character gained power without training for it, as per the established standards for the world. They also cite ruining existing characters, especially Aang, on top of other lore inconsistencies. Naturally, there are people who enjoyed the show responding to all these claims, fighting them at every turn. And people on the outside, including the media, seem to have taken their side. There are countless articles, videos, and posts of people defending the new show, saying the fans are just being toxic, and cite the backlash from fans, including harassment sent to actors, as proof. This naturally makes you even more angry, frustrated, furious even, because you haven't done any of that. You just didn't like the new show, for very good reasons. And you aren't the only one. There are some social media channels and sites that agree with you. They are seemingly just as angry as you. They speak to your frustrations, and it's validating. Not only that, they seem to have identified who is responsible for the choices that ruined the show for you. Incoming executives, women who talk about adding diversity to the Avatar franchise, saying that it was too much of a boys' club before. The main executive was also seen wearing a "She is Female" shirt in a group photo. These women also don't seem to understand and or care about the franchise as it had been before, with its themes of balance and connection, and just seem to want to do their own thing. Some deliberately say they are updating it for a modern audience with modern identity politics. So, with a target to direct your anger at, and the media and most other YouTubers still dismissing the fans as misogynistic, you subscribe to the channels that mirror your rage, and you stay loyal and supportive even as they get more radical with their opinions, and start to rail against any mention of diversity. Can you imagine being in a position like that? I can, because I almost was. The only thing that stopped me from falling into that pipeline was the fact that I had been taught from a young age to accept LGBT people and the women in my life. And the fact that I realized Kathleen Kennedy is more likely well-intentioned, but incompetent, as shown by Marshall Lucas's comments, and the fact that she forgot about the EU despite being the one to erase it. Thankfully, that scenario I just described is not the world we live in, at least for the Avatar franchise, yet. The first sequel series we actually got, The Legend of Korra, is still considered a good show by the fandom despite its flaws, and that includes myself as well. I may hate Season 2, but Seasons 3 and 4 were more than worth the time I spent watching. Let's just hope it doesn't happen with the new Avatar series that's coming out soon. By the looks of it, some pretty drastic actions were taken, but we'll just have to wait and see. As a side note, this whole segment was inspired by a similar one from this video by Arlo, addressing the fandom division and toxicity accusations in the Paper Mario fanbase. Bottom line is, if you did that to any popular franchise, made a sequel at the end of a major arc, then gave it the Last Jedi treatment, the fanbase, assuming it was big enough, would look just as toxic as the Star Wars fandom does today. In fact, let's take a look at a few I've talked about in this channel. Picture a world in which the heroes of Olympus started up with Percy Jackson having disappeared, and he's eventually found, but is now an angry, jaded, selfish hermit who doesn't care about protecting his friends or trying to make things better. Picture a world where My Hero Academia got a sequel in which Deku is found after a villainous takeover of Japan, and he doesn't care about being a hero and saving people anymore. Picture a world in which the next One Piece arc started up with some new pirates searching for Luffy, only to find him isolated on an island without his desire to become king of the pirates, will to protect his friends, or even his voracious appetite. Do you honestly think their fanbases would look any better than the Star Wars fanbase does right now? Better yet, can you honestly say that those stories would be made objectively better by such decisions because they are darker and quote-unquote more realistic? I don't care how much you love The Last Jedi or the Snyder Cut or whatever. Your opinion is your own. All I ask is that you don't try to tell people their opinion is objectively bad or wrong. Though I do feel the need to add a disclaimer here, do not go and harass anyone. Doing that at all will always cause more harm than good. In this day and age, we need to remember that the people who engage with these fan rage spaces are still people, not mindless bots or cartoon caricatures. They have feelings, like humility and mockery, and it can be quite enjoyable, even addictive to make fun of them. But there are reasons I avoid online drama whenever possible. Online drama, when taken too far, has consequences. In my video on why supporting Harry Potter is supporting J.K. Rowling, I told a personal story about two content creators from a different platform who I accidentally got into a years-long flame war that ended up in one of them getting banned. In the video, I brought that up to make a point about the power influencers have, as one of those creators was far more popular than the other. That point I made about emotional investment applies to franchise creators and influencers too. A fan's investment in something can cause them to stick with it despite all the signs that they ought to stop. Sticking with an IP despite the fact that all the new entries have sucked. Sticking with an influencer despite them being a terrible person who is able to hurt other people because of their success and influence. Or desperately clinging to a particular view of a franchise and attacking anyone who disagrees with you because you think your view of it is the correct one. You are entitled to your opinion, and you are entitled to share it with your fellow fans. You just shouldn't try to force your opinion forward as the correct interpretation. On the other side of that issue, don't let others' opinions sway you. If you like The Last Jedi, don't let my dislike of it prevent you from enjoying it. I only ask that you respect me for disagreeing. Don't let anyone tell you your enjoyment or lack thereof is illegitimate or wrong. And most certainly don't let anyone tell you that something you like is objectively bad or lesser because XYZ. In my research for my initial Star Wars video, I came across this article in which the author insists that Star Wars fans don't deserve The Last Jedi. I'll admit I haven't read the whole article, I'm not paying to read the rest of this, but everything I'm able to read from it essentially boils down to the fact that Star Wars is a simple good versus evil story written for kids. It's not that deep, but The Last Jedi is dark, realistic, and a whole lot deeper, so it is just better, and the fans who hate it are just not appreciating it. Star Wars is not that great, but The Last Jedi is. The author thinks they're being smart, but this is just arrogant asshole snobbery 101. It kind of bleeds over into the idea that media that's more simplistic and or aimed at kids or mass audiences is objectively less valuable or less worthy of respect. First and foremost, even simple stories take a creative vision and hard work to bring to life properly, and they can be executed very well, and they can be just as impactful on someone as a story that's more complex. I'll remind you all that we live in a world in which a cartoon from Nickelodeon is considered one of the greatest pieces of media of the last quarter of a century, and still has analysis videos coming out to this very day. And a preschool show about cartoon dogs is being watched, enjoyed, and even loved by adults who cry and buy merch of it. I'm not saying we should judge movies like A New Hope on the same metric as movies like Citizen Kane. I'm just saying they can both impact people in different ways, and that Star Wars and other simple stories wouldn't be able to impact their fans the way they do if they were as dark, realistic, or deep as other movies. And no, Martin Scorsese, you don't get to delegitimize Marvel movies because you find them too samey and too safe. Cinema is an incredibly broad term like any medium of art, and no one person gets to define it, no matter what accomplishments they've made in the medium of film, or how simple-minded they personally find the movies. If Martin Scorsese was just expressing disappointment and/or dislike of the MCU, that would be perfectly fine. But his position as a recognized figure in the film industry doesn't give him the right to dictate what is or is not recognized as art. You can absolutely call something bad art, but you shouldn't call something not art. And that's coming from someone who fell out of love with the MCU years ago. Okay, with all that established, I can finally get to the most controversial part of this video. My honest thoughts on Rian Johnson. Rian Johnson has come under a lot of flack for his role in the sequel trilogy, most notably writing and directing The Last Jedi. I'm sure we've all seen the clips of him and Mark Hamill, in which Hamill tells him you should listen to the fans, and Rian Johnson just rejected him saying, "No, we need to think about our movie." And Hamill buries his head in his hands. Basically, Rian Johnson is someone who does what he wants with his films regardless of what people expect from him. And while I can respect that as an aspiring artist and storyteller, I cannot respect him for doing that in a franchise he did not create, in a trilogy he did not start. I also want to say I do think he's a good director. I personally really enjoyed Glass Onion. I'd give it at least an 8 out of 10. But I don't like the idea of him handling someone else's IP after seeing what he did to Star Wars. Knowingly doing something that goes against what the original creator wanted is, in my opinion, disrespectful to said original creator and the fanbase. A fanbase that you did not cultivate for a franchise you did not create. Yes, the thing you made might be good in its own way, and even develop a fanbase of its own, even out of the original fanbase, but it's still an act of disrespect. You can feel free to disagree with me in the comments on this one. This is just my opinion after all. And I know this is bringing up the concept of death of the author, which is a hotly debated topic after all, but I've got my reasons for why I have this attitude. If you spent a massive part of your life working on something until it became too big a burden for you to bear anymore, so you had to pass it on, wouldn't you want it to be treated with respect? I know Lucas didn't directly hire Rian Johnson, but still, wouldn't you at least want your life's work to be treated with respect for your original vision? As a point of comparison, I'm going to bring up two counterexamples. Both are cases in which the original creator worked on a beloved story and genre staple of their respective mediums, but had to leave the main story of the franchise to others to complete. The Wheel of Time, the book specifically this time, not the show, and Berserk. Starting with the former, since it's the one I'm most familiar with. The key point here is that the original author of the books died before he was able to complete the series, leaving the story to be completed by Brandon Sanderson, who wasn't the superstar author that he is now. Keep that in mind, it will be important later. But he was an accomplished author and a massive fan of Wheel of Time, which was why he was picked up by the original author's widow/editor, Harriet McDougall, to potentially finish the series. And while he did make his own choices with the last 3 books, he did everything he could to stick to Robert Jordan's original vision, and lo and behold, fans loved it. Not only that, but Harriet worked with him on some of his other projects, and it left the door open for a lot of Wheel of Time fans to move on and start reading his solo works, which is part of what brought him to where he is now, the biggest fantasy author without a major adaptation of his work. If Brando Sando had the same attitude as Rian Johnson, the end of Wheel of Time would not have been nearly as well received. A lot of fans would have hated it, and it would be a lot harder to recommend, knowing the original intended ending would never be written. Actually, that would never have happened because Harriet would have kicked him off the project as soon as she realized what he was doing. But that is not the world we live in, thankfully. Now, I don't know much about the continuation of Berserk, but I do know that the guy who picked it up, like Sanderson, is an accomplished artist in the same medium. And he was friends with Kentaro Miura, which is why he even heard the ending in the first place. He has also been adamant that he is only sticking with what was directly dictated to him by Kentaro Miura, and that seems to be working out well. In any case, if he approached finishing Berserk with the same attitude that Rian Johnson approached Star Wars, I guarantee you, the Berserk fanbase would not look the same as it does today. What further compounded my feelings on The Last Jedi and the sequel trilogy as a whole was when I came across 2 other examples of seeing a trilogy of massive stories being finished. Each entry in the trilogy had a largely different main cast with a different main plot, and the final entry in the trilogy was basically an epilogue for the greater story. both of which were also stories I went through over the course of my life and only finished in my adulthood, and both of them I absolutely adore. They are The Trials of Apollo and Xenoblade Chronicles 3. So The Trials of Apollo is something I've gushed about before on this channel, but for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'll give you a quick rundown. The Trials of Apollo is the third in a trilogy of pentalogies of books that author Rick Riordan calls the Camp Half-Blood Chronicles, which consist of Percy Jackson and the Olympians, the one most of you are familiar with by far, the Heroes of Olympus, and of course the Trials of Apollo. The base premise of the series is that the Greek gods are real and they often have children with mortals, called half-bloods or demigods. Half-bloods tend to lead troubled lives, since they are often targeted by monsters that still exist and are hidden from mortal eyes. The central figure here, the Luke Skywalker equivalent at least, is obviously Percy Jackson. And I'm not going to rehash his entire journey here. I've already done that in numerous other videos. But what's important to know for us today is that he was the protagonist of the original series. Even with all the other important characters, it was really his story. It was first-person narration told from his perspective. But when Heroes of Olympus rolled around, he wasn't the protagonist anymore. He was a main character, certainly, but it wasn't really his story anymore. And it was more about all the new characters, their journeys, and the greater story of the world. Hence why this series switches to third-person narration. And then it was time for Trials of Apollo. Yes, Apollo had been a part of the story up until that point, but he does go through a really compelling character arc. But aside from that, it also acted as an epilogue for most of the characters we had grown fond of throughout the previous two series. Each book gives 2 or 3 of them a chance to shine, including Percy, who finally got to retire from being the god's errand boy. I know there's the Senior Year Adventures trilogy that takes place before Trials of Apollo and stars Percy again, but he isn't saving the world this time, and the story is also about him letting go. No characters were outright assassinated or had their stories retroactively made pointless by amounting to nothing, aside from arguably 2 of them, but that sentiment isn't common in the fandom. And I overall just felt rewarded for going through it all. It was genuinely one of the most satisfying experiences I've ever had as a reader. Moving over to Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which as the name implies, is the third in a trilogy of very long video games. All 3 of which star a plucky band of underdog heroes living in a massive world populated by gigantic beings called Titans. The heroes always embark on a journey to save their world from an as-of-yet unseen threat. Along the way, they help those in need, recruit others to their cause, and slowly discover how their world really works, and the dark forces that are really in control, along with revealing compelling themes about the cyclic nature of human conflict. Eventually, through struggle and sacrifice, the heroes win the day, and their worlds are free to live in peace. Xenoblade 3 is like this, but it also features members of the cast from the previous 2 games, and they spent the rest of their lives protecting people, doing what they've always done. While I could complain about how their decisions didn't lead to a permanent impact when that was what the end of the games implied, it did still clearly have a positive lasting effect that ultimately led their worlds in the right direction. And again, I felt very satisfied seeing everything culminate, and it was a very rewarding experience for me. And both of those experiences have shown me what Star Wars could have been if handled by people who understood it and wanted to do it justice. Instead of that, I feel cheated for sticking with the franchise as long as I did. And if that isn't a sign to just walk away, then I don't know what is. I may not possess any right to decide what to do with the franchise, but I have every right to just walk away and not give them my time and money if I no longer feel it's worth it to me. And that's why I can't respect anyone who just has their way with a franchise they did not create and probably don't even like. Fundamentally, they are handling something they did not create, something that does not really belong to them. And when you're handling something that does not belong to you, isn't it common courtesy to treat it with respect and don't do anything the original creator would not want you to do? So with all that said, what do we do about all this? I realized while writing the script for this video that this was ultimately a lesson in respect. Respect for other fans who may disagree with you for one reason or another, because we're all people with opinions on media and probably too much time on our hands, but also respect for creatives, and I mean this for the industry and the fans. Corporate executives don't really respect creativity, if how readily they've embraced AI didn't indicate this already. And this really ought to change. Fans, on the other hand, have a habit of taking it for granted and not really understanding what goes into it. I'm not sure how to fix these problems, but we should keep them in mind so if we ever get the opportunity to change the industry, we take it. Just remember, You are entitled to your opinion and where you decide to spend your time and money, but no one else's. And if something you're invested in is falling off, such as a movie series or TV show going on after its natural endpoint, or is getting worse and worse over time, you should consider turning away, no matter how much you're invested. Same sort of thing with being invested in an influencer or franchise creator. I don't know what that says about me, but I certainly wouldn't blame any of my fans for disengaging with my content if they weren't enjoying it anymore, and had no other reason to keep watching. Though, real talk, right now I could use the help. I lost my job several months ago, and did several things to try and get another job, but none of them worked. Despite the fact that a family member agreed to take care of my housing needs, my financial future is a little bit uncertain, so I could use the help. If you can't help me directly, you can always help just by liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. All the things YouTubers tell you to do. They really do make a difference. I am Kylan Mythos, and I'll see you all next time. And hopefully, I never need to talk about The Last Jedi in a video like this ever again. Because I'm just tired of it at this point.